What is going on, everyone? It is David Palmer, Leo King, and Dr. Ann Wolke here with History in the Stars. Today, we're going to be talking about quite an interesting subject. Is Elon Musk the really intense Thomas, I can't remember his name, Cromwell of Henry VIII schism from the church that Trump is now doing with Doge and Elon? What do you think, Ann? It's good to be with you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderfully. And yes, I think it's a really interesting topic that we're going to be discussing today. After yesterday of seeing Elon Musk and his son in the Oval Office with Trump, talking about the activities of Doge and what they've been up to. And it's just really interesting that under similar astrology, Henry VIII was uncovering the overspending of the monasteries in England.
A lot of it, corruption, also the idea of what the sovereignty of the country is and its, way that it can lay its own law of its own land. It also, it's a monarch compared to, a republic that has, of course, a president and an executive branch with two other branches, but it is an interesting correlation of this idea of foreign energies and the monies that go out of the country to other countries and stopping that. And it's really odd because we are literally in the same place with Pluto and Aquarius that it was with Henry VIII. And it just blows my mind, the stuff that we're going to show to people today, because we've discussed this before, yet we've never actually gotten to the details. And actually, with everything that's popped up since President Trump came into his second term with Elon Musk and this Doge, the pushback, it makes you really want to go deeper in the history of being Henry VIII at this very extreme time that we're living in astrologically, the same ingress from Pluto into Aquarius, but who were his advisors? Who were the people that really helped him make that schism from the Catholic Church? And what was it like? What were the people like? And so that's what we're really going to cover today. And I think it's going to be fun for people to actually see the history and see some really interesting correlations of what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think it's important what you talked about right away, that we're comparing a monarch under a system of monarchy where it's not disputed who's going to come to the throne, and we're comparing that to a modern president. So we're not necessarily saying anything about what Trump is doing is tyrannical or is going to turn into something that a king would do. And I do think that a lot of times people want to go there and compare it right away, that it's some sort of a tyranny. But what I think we're seeing is someone in the office of the president operating to the boundaries of his authority, and also bringing in innovations in a similar way that Henry VIII was pushing at the bounds of his authority as a monarch. And as a monarch, he was able to, if you dissented from him, he could chop off your head. So I'm not saying, or we're not going to try to say that Trump will do that to people today, right? But it's just very interesting to see that these are similar times where there's innovations happening in how government runs and trying to break from old systems and having those kinds of ideas of, these outside authorities don't have any agency in the countries that they're talking about, right? Resisting what's being portrayed as outside authorities. So the similarities are there, and we've talked about it before, but actually seeing these things play out, we start to see, oh, okay, who's the Elon Musk then in this earlier period of time? And it's not going to be exactly the same. And unfortunately, we don't know Thomas Cromwell's birthday, so we can't compare him exactly to Elon Musk.
No, and that's a good point about, to make the comparison of Elon Musk to Thomas Cromwell. We know the year Thomas Cromwell was born, so we can at least look at some of the planets that are signatures that are similar, because we don't know the month, so we can't say what sign he is, but we can see, using planets and especially transits that are happening and whether or not there's some sort of signatures. I do think that it's also important to maybe help some people that might not understand the schism from the Catholic Church of how big a deal it is. I mean, it's Reformation at its true, most powerful, like worldwide, most impactful version of Reformation, because it literally is a country, a king, and a nation completely defying and saying goodbye and not relating with the Catholic Church, which hadn't been done. And the way that we look at it maybe today is, what are we having this schism in America from? It's really interesting that it goes into these more nuanced but smaller things that turn into big things. Like the monasteries back in England were Catholic monasteries by the church, and they were collecting their taxes. And so the money that the people of England were going to these monasteries, going to their local place to worship, they were paying their dues to the church, and the money was going to help the Vatican, but it's not like the Vatican was giving money back and helping the country or the poor there or anything like that. So it kind of reminds me of what we've been kind of seeing of this USAID or this USAID, how much money we give out, yet none of it comes back in, and a lot of it's also been very fraudulent. So, and it's interesting, there's a lot of like pieces of that fraudulent stuff we have to go over today. But I think that, just the whole setup of this understanding that really I think gets me is, since you are so well versed as a history professor, and this is your time period in England, to have a monarch make such a big decision, is it normal to have monarchs change their highest advisors? Was that pretty common, or was that not common? Like, I'm just asking as a general question, because of course we see that in American politics. I mean, the cabinet members can change quick, or whoever your special advisor is and so forth. But is it usually based around a big decision? And I guess, is there anything comparable you can think of? Because I think it's a little bit more dramatic with the Catholic Church being involved. So, of course, there's the cardinal that's sent by the Pope that's on the court of the king, and like really getting rid of people that you think would never leave. So it's like more about the ideology, or this kind of like the English person at the time that's just like, that will never leave. The cardinal that's there, Wolsey, like he'll always be there. The monasteries, they'll always be there. I'm trying to find that relation to like now, where it's almost like the Department of Education will always be there. Now, at the time of us doing this, it's still there, the Department of Education, but it's being talked about dismantling it and getting rid of it. So it reminds me of the similar thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very similar. I think that you talked about how England was paying tithes to the Catholic Church, right? As members of the Roman Catholic Church, the English have to pay into the church. But so what they would have been expecting in return to make the church accountable was, are we getting the services we're supposed to be getting from the church? So it's pretty similar, I think, that you have an agency now that was set up at a particular time in the 60s, right? USAID, isn't it? It was set up in...
Yeah, under JFK.
Mm-hmm. I was trying to do the math in my head, how many years ago that was versus when the Tudor state was founded in 1485. I should know that.
That's the same year that Cromwell was born.
Yeah. So
pretty wild.
Yeah, I was trying to think of how
Cromwell,
many years that the Tudor state had even been in existence, so that people at that point, when the Tudor state was founded, it was the end of the Wars of the Roses. There had been a lot of strife amongst the kings and nobles, and finally there's a new monarch and a new state gets created, and we've talked about that, right? And then things start to kind of fall apart, and people worry because Arthur died young, right? And he was supposed to be the king. So Henry VII's son, Arthur, was the oldest son, and he was supposed to take over from Henry VII, but Arthur dies before Henry VII.
In 1503.
You just mentioned that. You did, yeah.
Yeah, my whole
about
Nostradamus
that.
presentation at Conscious Life Expo goes into the secret of Nostradamus's birthday being the actual secret to knowing how to prophesize through astrology, which it is pretty wild if you look at 1503 and everything that happened and how it set the course of that whole entire Renaissance period and the world as we know it today.
It is, yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah,
wild.
it actually, and I was getting ready to say, no, it did. I really thought about your presentation while I was doing a lecture this week. And the lecture was all about the consumption of coffee and how that changed. It's actually interesting. We could do a whole show on coffee. But in 1555, the first coffee house was created. And I think that's an interesting date too. But, and 1503 is so important for world history. And really what's happening right now is that we're really coming to the end of a cycle that started around that time.
Right.
And it connected the world globally. We had the revolution in the midst of that at like one of the Pluto returns.
Yeah.
And now here we are again, and it's almost like we're at that point of reseeding the new. And you talked about that over the weekend at the Conscious Life Expo.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting because that's where a lot of the grievance of Henry VIII starts to make the schism is because of that moment where his brother dies, who's married to Catherine, and then the Pope is the one who decides ultimately to have Henry now be married to the widow of his dead brother. And actually going into a lot of the research, I think the lawyers, there was lawyers back then. The lawyers against the Catholic Church were really good that Henry had, because the way that they frame it against the biblical framing that the Catholic Church had, it really didn't make sense. It makes more common sense from what was being said from Henry's lawyers.
Well, yeah, because the biblical teaching was confusing, because one part of the Bible suggests that Henry should marry his brother's widow, but another part of the Bible argued the opposite, that he shouldn't. And so the Pope had come down on one side of it and ruled, okay, I say it's okay for you to marry your brother's widow. And remember, we've talked about this too. Henry was the defender of the faith. He was the Pope's most loyal subject as a king. I mean, you had to be at that time because there were pretty powerful monarchs that were connected with the Pope, and you didn't want to go against them. So Henry wants to be the king monarch,
right,
the one that the Pope likes the best. And when Luther starts the Reformation, Henry is completely opposed to that. But really, he was opposed to this idea of there being no authority. He wants to replace the authority of the Pope in his realm with his own authority. He's arguing that he should be the head of the church in the realm. And that argument has to happen legally. So it really is the first time where he's actually arguing the Pope doesn't have this authority. That should only be God's authority, right? And
Yes.
so because you can't really appeal to the religious authority, he needs to bring in lawyers. And it's really, it's a symbol of this era. That era was the rise of these secular states that were still religious, but they figure out ways to use the laws of their kingdom to take on the most powerful authority, the most powerful, like, accepted authority of that time.
Yeah. I wanted to show people here just like a couple things, because we're on that subject during like the law parts of it. Like right here, there is kings are ordained by God to have dominion in their realms, whereas the Bishop of Rome has no biblical warrant to rule England, right? That was one of those. There was, of course, the one that was going into the marriage, which I thought was really interesting. Henry was arguing that the lack of a son that she never was able to bear was a divine displeasure. I thought that one's kind of weak.
Well, that was
And
very
that was,
important
right,
because
yeah.
he actually, it wasn't even that it was the lack of a son, but his wife had had stillbirths that were boys. And so really people would believe, I mean,
Yeah, spiritually,
I
I
don't know
get
how much
it.
he was torn up about it, right? But people would buy that argument. So.
Well, even in the old days, there was actually a great movie that was just done a couple years ago that even in France and England, that if a woman wasn't able to even get pregnant, that she didn't love him. That means that she was not into him. And even with the consummation, right, that there was no true love there. And so it was that she was probably either cheating or whatever. And I know in today's world, people would freak out about that, but that was common in the old days. And it's a true story that there was a woman that actually, like, it was kind of funny because I think they kind of allured that she did cheat, but it was not willingly, that she was raped, and that the child of her actually was not her husband.
Right. That's how they would make an argument against a woman who was a victim of rape. If she conceived, it meant that she enjoyed it.
Yeah, then she enjoyed it. Correct. But this was about right here that the marriage was insidious in God's eyes. Catherine had been the widow of Henry's older brother Arthur and therefore cursed. I like how back then they spoke. And then citing the Bible in Leviticus 20:21, Henry contended that if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. So it's like proving his childless of a son, of an heir, because there is that other layer, because he's a monarch and he's supposed to, back then, of course, it's the male line, right? You want to have a male heir and she can't provide the heir. And obviously it's in the Bible that you're not supposed to take, it's unclean to take your brother's wife. He has to, and the Pope's the one who does it. So it's kind of like the perfect argument. Mm-hmm. I mean, really. And it's funny because to relate to what we're at now, this kind of isn't part of it, but it's the stuff that comes after this that is in many ways. But I think that, the other one is the king saw the death of his infant sons and absence of a male heir as punishment from God for marrying his brother's wife. And then there was also that the disposition allowing him to marry Catherine, granted in 1503, was invalid because no pope has the right to permit what God's law forbade. So it was interesting seeing all these different arguments. And then the theological justification for the break was freeing his conscience and kingdom from a papally sanctioned wrongdoing. And by 1533, after years of deadlock, Henry acted on this conviction. He married Anne Boleyn without Rome's approval, so he went totally rogue. And then, of course, tasked Cranmer, who was ending up being his archbishop of the new Church of England, to annul this unlawful union with Catherine. And Henry thus presented himself as loyal to God's love above all. So that's kind of where the interesting part of like natural laws came in, even through, people think it's the Constitution, but it's this, then it moves to the Pilgrims, right? With their Mayflower Compact and their idea of natural law by God. It's the people there's no monarch though. It's the people for the first time creating this kind of agreement of a state when they end up in Plymouth. The Mayflower Compact is really the first of that comes with this idea of natural law. And then we see natural law in its own kind of right being much more of like, you're allowed to be who you want, marry who you want, do what you want without a king or any of the state, period. And that's what America is today. So it's interesting to see that it is an evolution from a Pluto cycle in Aquarius to the next one by 1777 from this period. That's all about this, natural God law opposed to the law that is written by people from other places dictating how you live your life.
Yeah.
Right? So there was also, and I think this is where it's going to get interesting because we're seeing a lot of legal challenges by federal judges with Doge, which is the same way, and if I were to make this make more sense. So Henry VIII's break with Rome, the key advisors, the justification, the opposition. So his key advisors in leaving. So we got to look at if this was Trump right now and his key advisors of breaking federal bureaucratic systems that have become created through whether it's Congress, executive branches of prior, or even whether you're in the World Health Organization, the WHO, and the monies we put to that and how it dictates health on us, right? It's the same kind of thing in all of it. And where is the, country able to sustain and make its own laws and also not be gutted and have wasteful spending, and also there's a lot of other claims that we'll show, but it's Thomas Cromwell who's the architect of the break with Rome. So he's like the figure of Elon now, which I think is really interesting because without Thomas Cromwell, would he have done it, you think, since you're the historian?
He was trying to do it before Thomas Cromwell was his chief advisor. So he was working with Thomas Wolsey to gain a divorce and making that argument already that he had gone against God's wishes in the Bible, right? And the Pope didn't have that right and whatever. And then he appoints Thomas More also to be someone who's advising him. And Thomas More was this great respected humanist who is the one who wrote Utopia.
That is such a crazy story, Anne.
I know. It is.
I've been citing it on some of my stuff lately.
Yeah.
Because we're in the astrology of Utopia, the book.
It came out in 1516, didn't it?
Right.
Or?
It's like the idea of 2019 with Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn, and about the different isles and the way that people live. And this idea of utopia is not utopian at all. In many ways, everybody has two slaves. Like, it's super crazy, that book. I was like, whoa. Mm-hmm. It has witches and Stargate astrologers and everybody living on these different isles. And it's really wild. But that's probably, they need to make that a movie.
I wonder if they ever have.
Like a modern movie, because it's pretty wild, but these are just some, while you're talking, I'm just putting some of the images up of like Thomas Cromwell.
And then let me see if I have the colored image.
Oh yeah, here you go.
But look, here's the opposing image that hung opposed to each other. So look at, that's Thomas More. And then if you show Thomas Cromwell, they oppose each other, and you can actually see these two portraits in at the Frick Museum in New York.
Wow.
You walk into a room and they're up above like the fireplace or something where they're actually opposed to each other. I loved it. It was such an English historian moment of like, oh, look at there they are. But anyway.
It's interesting how Thomas More is a little bit more regal, I should say, in that portrait, where Thomas Cromwell's a lot more Protestant looking, like not so flashy.
Well, he wasn't as flashy, but Thomas More he was a humanist, and he also, this will tell you about his reputation. He's a saint within the Catholic Church today. All right, so he's considered a martyr for the Roman Catholic Church because of Henry VIII. So
he's a lot like, Joan of Arc's same thing too.
Yeah, but it's different, I guess.
It's different. I'm just saying that
to lead the proper king to the throne,
right? But that's what the Catholic Church seems to do. Is like anybody who really ends up doing something very big in a way that assists the Catholic Church, they turn him into a saint.
Yeah, they're not going to make Thomas Cromwell a saint. Right,
no, he gets excommunicated, which is kind of interesting, but yeah.
Thomas More actually died because he refused to take that oath of supremacy. And, he was appointed by Henry VIII to help him with the divorce and to help him, negotiate through this really difficult time. I have no clue.
So he's like the Mitch McConnell.
Is he? I was actually wondering, who is he? Because he is actually a Pluto Virgo, like Elon Musk. But so I was wondering, but he's nothing like Elon Musk, right? So Thomas More.
Here, I'm going to put it up my screen. Watch this. Look at this. Mitch McConnell, welcome to the resistance. Mitch McConnell bucks Trump with no votes. He's voted no on every single pick that Trump wants the most to be his surrounding energy, his Thomas Cromwell, his Anne Boleyn, right? He's voted no. He's the only Republican who's like, no. And he just voted no against Tulsi Gabbard. He's the only Republican who didn't vote for Tulsi Gabbard. So Thomas More is the Mitch McConnell.
Is he? Maybe, but he was more, so he was sort of like a celebrity of his time.
I'm just trying to kind of get people like that, like somebody that's on the same team, but going against it and says, no, I'm not going to go for this.
Yeah, he was on the same team, and he just asked Henry to keep him out of the divorce proceedings. He's like, I'll be here for you. I'll help you with everything else, but please don't ask me to be involved in the divorce, because I think the Pope, by being a good Roman Catholic that I am, I can't go against the Pope. And he expected Henry VIII to respect that. I don't know why, but I guess it was before Henry VIII started executing people. And he was then put on trial and executed. And interestingly enough, he was executed on the day before the feast of Thomas Becket, who was another martyr who went against the King of England and was killed. So
I don't think people are going to be killed now.
No.
But it's interesting because if you think of Mitch McConnell, one of the reasons why he didn't vote for Tulsi is because of the Edward Snowden situation, where she calls for him to be pardoned. Yeah. And that's his big thing, his refusal to call former government contractor Edward Snowden a traitor, right? For her not doing that. So it's the same kind of, to me, it's very similar. And then same thing with the health stuff. Mitch McConnell is going to vote no, he says, for RFK because pharmaceutical companies he loves, right? Or with Pete Hegseth, no. There's this no, I'm going to do what the original way the government has always been. This disruptive thing I do not want at all. Yeah. So that's a good way to kind of paint Thomas More, I guess you could say, right? Is more traditional. I don't want to break away. I don't want to disturb the way things have been going.
Yeah, and it's not even in his mind. even though he wrote about utopia, wouldn't you think he would be all for a completely new system? Because he was writing in that same context of Europe had been fighting over religious issues like almost all of his life, and he's tired of it. So he wants there to be a utopia where everybody has their own servant.
Well, it goes away from his own vision. And then at the same time, I feel like maybe he wrote it because he was afraid to watch it be implemented too. Sometimes people like to dream and write a fantasy, but then to go create that fantasy,
he thinks the fantasy, he's not giving up this idea that the fantasy can be created in the existing system. And that's where I think there's such a similarity of now, is that, what is this? What side are you on?
Oh, right.
What side are you on is a huge thing.
I mean, don't have me. That's going to be in my head for the rest of the night. What side are you on? Do.
Okay.
And for people that don't know, it's just a song going on against the Thomas Cromwell of today, Elon Musk, and Doge.
Is it the Doge cuts, or is it also the Department of Education, or is it everything?
It's everything that Doge is doing.
Okay.
It's for civil servants they're representing.
Okay.
But I think it's really interesting kind of helping people see, like, okay, so like Thomas More was on the team, but once it got into the thick, he would not, back then, of course, he had to pledge his like full loyalty, right?
Yeah, so
and
the king
so
had
and actually
passed
make a pledge.
As that legal reformation started, the king's passing acts that's forcing Thomas More to take a side, and he won't take the side the king wants, and that's because he's being a good Catholic. He's standing up for what he believes in, and he can't be pressured with, all of these promises of you'll get your own house when we dissolve the monasteries. We can give you a huge estate or whatever.
That's interesting.
In like, there's a movie about this called A Man for All Seasons, and it's a play also, and it depicts More as a person who can't be bribed. So he'd be the Republican senator who refuses to take pharmaceutical money and is above reproach, is perfect. I don't know if there is one like that.
But are we sure about that? If he's,
I don't know.
because to me, that's I think been the problem we're seeing is this higher than mighty. I'm doing the right thing as I'm taking the money from. At that time, I want the Pope to see me better than my own king. I want the church to see me better than my own king. And who's not to say that there were cardinals helping him, backing him up, right? That's where it kind of gets in the really interesting declassification that will probably never happen of the times of the schism, of how many agents of the Catholic Church were working against Henry VIII during the schism, right?
So maybe Thomas More was this secret plant trying to keep Henry loyal. And they're saying, who could hate Thomas More? This lovable Christian humanist.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
To me, when it's with Pluto and Aquarius, it's about rebellion. It's about doing things different. It's about changing up things that have been old, stagnant, and also have, not all parts, but definitely some very corruptive and controlling aspect over people's lives, and changing that. And so to me, when you take that side, which side are you on? When you're taking the side of staying with the same old.
Yes. Yeah.
To me, it's like turning a blind eye to so much truth. And also, I think it's a fear. A grip on the norms that, some people in life psychologically, that's a lot, nobody goes through letting go of our normal way of life easy. I mean, whether it's a breakup, whether it's a new job, whether it's, there's a lot of things in life when the world disrupts you in your own life that it's hard for us to, when things are humming and drumming nice. But I think it's at these moments which are rare every 248 years, that do bring up that in a very extreme way. And we all have to see that side that says, hey, this is actually better for the people. It allows people to be more free. Of course, in 1531 and 32 and 33, maybe it's not total freedom like now, but it's the first biggest step of that freedom. Mm-hmm. In, if you use the last 2,000 years, right, those 2 millennium, like that's the big moment that really shatters the 1,500 years prior of really like, we are going against this kind of all these countries centralized around the Catholic Church and where it was moving and different places and so forth after the Crusades and the failure of the Crusades. You really hadn't seen since the Templar Knights, really, this kind of, stand away from the Catholic Church and doing their own thing and getting away with it. Because that's the other thing is I think Henry would have been terrified in a way. So it takes a lot of courage to do what he did because the Catholic Church put their foot on the Templar Knights after the Crusades and used another king to end them, so because they were starting their own money system. They had their own systems that were going in Jerusalem and so forth.
Cycle again, right? Right there.
That was a Pluto Saturn cycle that came in 1284, right? So, but by 1307, it's kind of the aftermath. And of course, times were slower then. So it takes a little, that's what Nostradamus, what I was trying to teach people is big transits will happen and they set the course for longer than people realize, right? Like 1503, for example, like, it's not until like a Saturn cycle later that we get to, it's this whole situation that happened with me having to marry my brother's wife. Yeah, this is not good. And that's the kickstart to this whole line of reasoning of leaving the Catholic Church, right? So
right, and it reminds me also of something that you said this weekend and other astrologers on that astrology panel of after you've made it through Pluto and Capricorn, which they had at this time, right? They'd made it through the most similar to transits to what we're experiencing now. And they're in Pluto in Aquarius.
Yes.
And someone like Thomas More is trying to hang on to the old Capricornian system, right? He's refusing to innovate truly and just let go. And if he had just signed that oath of supremacy, I wonder what would have happened. It could have all happened anyway. What are we looking at with
We're just looking at Henry after the schism's made and him now standing with his new wife, Anne Boleyn, and him also now...
That's Jane Seymour.
Oh, is that Jane Seymour? So
yeah, I think...
I don't know why they threw that in here, but it's still the idea of like he's now the head of the church and the state.
I think that's
and he's... There is no more connection to Rome at all. The other interesting kind of that I brought up during the Nostradamus thing this weekend was that it also set the precedent that after the schism, that by the time that you get to near the end of Henry's reign, that the popes that come in after that go for a 455-year cycle where it's all Italian popes. So there is this kind of freak out that if I were to look at it, I'm not a historian, right? Technically, but I would look at it as like, well, the Catholic Church inside and the cardinals always elected an Italian pope all the way up until John Paul II to try and maintain this kind of like for sure energy of Italian, because it's in Italy, the Vatican. So there is something to say that it also sets a precedent, what he does, by then Rome and the church being always having an Italian be the Pope that follows that for 455 years. It's not until our just modern times of when we've seen popes that are not Italian, like a German, right? Or South American.
Yeah, I'm sitting here trying to think about, really, that's really interesting because Thomas Wolsey had been thinking, if I play the game right, I'll end up as Pope, right? He was really
An
trying
English
to lobby
Pope, right?
to be the first English Pope.
Right. And it
And
never
their reaction
happens.
was, nope.
And they
right?
probably always were going to be that way.
And then also there'd been a time where, right, we talked about this, when the Pope was moved to Avignon, and
Yes.
that it was, again, because the church, I mean, actually, we could look at this from the perspective of the Roman Catholic Church, also going internal and saying, all right, that's enough. We're not doing any more of this external influence. We are our own power authority, right?
Right.
And let's get away from getting embroiled in these state conflicts. Forget about the English and the French. It's just Italians we can trust.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because then it also becomes on the same half, England becoming only trusting the English when it comes to the church now. That it's the monarch and it's the archbishop, right, that becomes of Canterbury that the king or the monarch chooses, and it becomes extremely English. Like now we only trust the English way to run the country, and that includes that it's ordained by God in that way, and the sovereignness that, you know, the monarch, that God, it's the same way that the Pope works, right? The idea, but it's not also cardinals choosing. It's just by God's blood lineage, right? Like that's what, and it's because of Henry. So it's kind of interesting. It's like there is a similar on both sides, because it's not like you've seen a monarch that's not English since Henry VIII. They've all been English.
They've been German too.
Oh, that's true.
The Hanoverians.
Yeah, okay.
Like the Georges. And they've been Dutch with William.
Yeah, the orange, right?
Yeah. But that was, Mary was, anyway, they all have an English connection or they wouldn't be a monarch.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or
But
Scottish.
so that's what's very interesting going into Thomas More, but it's Thomas Cromwell that's the big one to really look at. And so going to him here, I like that he, with this deep research, the architect of the break. So he also becomes Henry's chief minister, 1534 through 1540. He's the architect. He was one of the most powerful proponents for the schism. And so he reminds me of Elon Musk very much, because like Trump tried in his first term to do this, but everybody from the Speaker of the House at the time in his first term wasn't on his page. Paul Ryan, right, wasn't on his page. A lot of people in the House and the Senate weren't. They were able to just get tax cuts done. That was about it. People within his own cabinet turned on him. They really weren't for it. So, and that's kind of the story that was happening with Henry while it was Pluto Capricorn in the 1520s. People were kind of like, I know it's a good gesture, but I don't know. So it kind of does take an architect or somebody who really becomes your biggest proponent, that stands by your side, that helps engineer, that's talking to the lawyers, that's talking to, and really on your team with it. And that reminds me of Elon Musk now coming in a second term during Pluto Aquarius. That's what's weird about the Trump presidency, is it's 2 terms split, and it's a Pluto Capricorn term, and then it's a full-blown Pluto Aquarius term. And so to see this Pluto Aquarius term is really interesting, because it is very different. And it's, Elon and your 25 kids, right? Your young college kids, like, you go figure out what's going on. And so it very much is similar to me about that.
Yeah, there's so much about it that's really dismantling the whole old system, including having all of those kids helping out too, right? Because it's totally innovative. It's thinking way outside the box, and people are freaking out as a result, because it's not anything anyone ever imagined. People are wondering, is this even legal? What kind of records are these people accessing?
Exactly.
Right. And I mean, Henry was going against the laws of the Catholic Church with what he did. in these unprecedented ways. So people in his kingdom would have been wondering, are we even going to be saved when our king is excommunicated by the Pope? And
Right.
like, should these people who aren't even nobles that come from these lowly births, should they be running our government?
Right, because Thomas Cromwell was not high esteemed family or didn't come from a lord. His family name, they were blacksmiths. They were, they were common folks. They worked in the fields. They worked in crops. They worked in,
Yeah,
and
so common we don't even know.
It was
his
interesting
birthday.
because his background, I looked into it. He was well traveled. Like he was in France. He was in Italy. So he at least knew the way the world worked in Europe. And then he came from a background with doing blacksmith. So he's a tradesman. So he did blacksmith work. He worked in fields. So he kind of understands the law of the land by being a traveler, but also by working with all kinds of people in lowly life, which is basically kingly life is the highest life. If you're a lord or you're in charge of something, a duke, or you're somebody that's in the monarch, and then everybody else is just lowly. So weird to me, but that's what's weird is now we see the kind of the flip where it's Elon Musk who's the most richest man in the world.
Yeah, that's what's so funny. But people absolutely don't see him as someone who should be in that role because he's the richest man in the world, and because he wasn't elected. Right.
I mean, I would think maybe having somebody who's poor in there would probably use their way to steal money, opposed to the richest guy who doesn't need money.
Well, he's the richest guy probably for a reason that he can see how to make
one
money,
way, yeah,
right? And he can see where there's waste, but at the same time, when you actually watch him speak, like at the Oval Office meeting yesterday was it, right? When his son is up on his shoulders,
right,
or just being cute there in the background or on the side, it gives more of a feeling of he has a human side, even though people don't want to depict him in that way. But it makes him more human, and you can relate. I know I can hear tons of people saying they can't relate to him, but it makes him more relatable than.
Well, Trump's the same way with his grandkids or his kids always around, and I mean, Elon Musk is a double Cancer, and then Trump has a lot of Cancer in his chart. So there's definitely
Henry VIII was a Cancer.
Yeah, and Henry VIII was a Cancer. So there's that Cancer element. Plus, we're seeing Mars retrograde in Cancer, and we're also seeing that it's a Cancer country that we live in, right, in Americas, right. So there is like this big form of that Cancer energy, and I do think that it's also interesting because while Henry becomes the supreme head, it's the spearheaded administrative and religious reforms that Cromwell does, and he oversees a royal commission. So it's the same way. Doge is a commission to inspect the monasteries, which the monasteries would be the best way to describe these federal agencies, or whether it's U.S. aid, Department of Education, and where's things going on that we're losing money, and also there's corruption, and that's what leads to the dissolution of the monasteries and the redirection of church wealth and power to the crown. So it's changing the money to come back into the crown. In our term, it would be this money shouldn't be going out anymore, and it should be staying in, and we should be putting it towards getting rid of our debt, getting rid of our problems, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, because that's the thing about the church at this time was they were supposed to be filling all these social services for people. So if you needed to go to a hospital, it was the church, or if you needed to go to,
right,
and also every aspect of your life, they're performing the baptisms, weddings, every aspect of your life, your will is filed in the church too. So they are like they're like the state agency where you go to do all your paperwork.
They're the DMV, they're the Social Security office, and all of those offices in one.
And they're supposed to be taking care of the poor and all sorts of things they're supposed to do, and furthering good and morality and spirituality in society. And so Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell decide we need to really investigate what they're actually up to. And the fact that they do these visitations,
I know.
and then you see lists of all the things they find. So first of all, when Henry
Do you want to show people the list? Because it's so crazy that Anne's able to have access. Of course, she's a history professor, so she can.
Well, I'll show this first one, and it's all, just keep in mind, all of the records at this time are written in Latin. So I wanted to show this one because first, I think the most primary objective of his visitation was to see, if I'm taking over this church, what wealth is actually there? Like what properties and what goods do they have, and how much money do they have, and what are they worth? So this is the whole inventory of all the things they find when they visit different monasteries and religious houses. So that's
that's exactly what Elon Musk is doing now when he's going into USAID, or he just went in the Department of Education. It's like, what's really going on in here? We don't know. What's crazy is nobody knows.
Well, look, this is actually, this part right here is in English, where it says, it talks about money that's going out for rents and then money that's coming in. It's going to be talking all about...
out to the hospital of St. James.
So all of the money going in and out. So that's the first accounting they do. And this is actually a picture from an illuminated text of the...
Wow, that's a beautiful...
Valor Ecclesiasticus from 1535. So that's showing Henry with his commission of all the people. So these are all of the, what is everybody saying about the 25-year-olds? Like, these
the
are
hairy
them.
balls. That's one of the...
Well, that's who these people are.
Yeah, the hairy balls of them. Okay, that's cool.
And then the other work they're doing, wait a second. I wanted to find the image first. Oh no, I want to continue the session. So in the visitation of the monasteries, they are also...
This is what blows my mind right here.
Yeah.
These transcripts...
They're going in, and this is recorded in Latin probably because any common person that sees it would be shocked to see what they uncovered or what they uncovered.
Well, and that's because the monasteries were all written in Latin anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's the language of the church. That's the official language of the legal profession also.
Yeah.
Right, so this is just an accounting going religious house by religious house and investigating what is actually going on there. So they know what's supposed to be going on in religious houses. And Henry wants to know what's actually happening. Oh no. And it took me out, but I also had AI do an overview of this. So let me find that really fast because of course I got logged out, or you could show something else. Well,
yeah, I was going to show the comparison to what we're seeing now. Like, so that's what Thomas Cromwell's doing. And this is what Elon's doing with Doge, right? Like here's a good example. Terminate, like this just came out an hour ago, right? The prepared date was 1/22. So 2 days after the inauguration, right? They're already finding this. So they haven't released it for a minute. And it's just money that's going out. And it's understanding what's to terminate here and the amount of money. Oh, that is $15 million here, right? So, and then it will describe EPA also canceled 3 DEI contracts, saving American taxpayers $45 million. So this is them showing that the $45 million was allotted to go to DEI and them terminating it 2 days after the inauguration. So so every part of this, here's 58 cancellations with the savings of $150 million in the category, including media, DEI, and consulting. Federal employee retirements are processed using paper by hand in an old limestone mine in Pennsylvania. Did you know that?
No.
Right? 700 plus mine workers operate 230 feet underground to process 10,000 applications per month. I did not know this about Iron Mountain. I think I had heard about it, but that is insane in the times we live in. And so this looks like a monastery that they would have walked into in the 1530s and been like, wow, what's going on in here? Right? Like, look at that room in the that's insane.
Right. Well, and it's like these institutions that have been operating with official sanctioning of the government, but really without oversight, because
Right.
nobody comes in from the state. And
So like here's one that was on February 7th. HHS canceled 62 contracts worth $182 million. These contracts were entirely for administrative expenses. None touched any healthcare programs. This included terminating a $168,000 contract for an Anthony Fauci exhibit at the NIH museum. So they show the totals, they go into it, and then look at Fauci exhibit. This price includes project management, site visits, detailing and samples, fabrication, back walls. So it's like we're paying, our taxpayer money is paying for Anthony Fauci to have an exhibit at a museum. Shouldn't the museum be paying that? Like, that's the thing when presidential museums happen, right? As the president, you have to fundraise and you have to get donations. The fact that somehow there's been these allotments inside of these agencies to give Fauci, who's just a government employee, he's not elected, his own exhibit
at the NIH museum,
right? That's just extremely crazy to me. So when I see the old going into the monasteries and recording everything, it reminds me of Elon Musk and Doge right now so much, and that's what Thomas Cromwell did.
Yeah,
it is wild.
So here's one of them. I mean, there are many different books. So I found one. I don't know if it was the same one, but it shows you, here's the actual record, and then this is the transcript. So when they visited the monasteries, that is, a visitation is going into taking account of what's happening there. So here's what they're looking for under the king's jurisdiction. It says whether divine service is duly observed, how many inmates there are or ought to be, and that doesn't mean prisoners, right? It means the religious people. Who were the founders? What increase of lands the house has had? So how much land have they acquired? Touching the rent, change of one habit for another, how the lands were given, state of the evidences, cause of exemption, mode of electing the master, the rule of the house and how it is observed, and whether any women are lodged in the precincts.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, and they find a lot. How far the articles specified in their rule are kept, the manner in which this is a Benedictine monasteries, the manner in which the Benedictine rule is kept by the inmates, seniors or otherwise, and what care the former take of the revenues and property, and how the master disposes of his preferments, impropriations, whether being excommunicated, the master ever said mass, instructions for the visitors to examine strictly into the windows, doors, and enclosures, and behavior of the nuns and how often they confess.
Wow, it's like actually putting them to their own rules that they expect other people to do that aren't the same but by the Bible, but then are they doing the quote unquote, what they've been given the ordinance from God to do and create these monasteries that are connected to the main church, and are they actually following the same procedures and laws that they're supposed to be doing?
Mm-hmm. So are they following their own laws? But then it goes to, are they following the king's laws? Because then it says, and this is what Thomas More was executed for, among other things, it is stated that they shall pray for the founder's soul, struck out by Cromwell. So whoever founded it, they're supposed to be praying for that soul. And for the king and his lawful wife, Queen Anne Boleyn, right? Mm-hmm. Added in Cromwell's hand, but afterwards struck out. And the Lady Elizabeth Princess there. Oh,
that's Princess Elizabeth I, or Queen Elizabeth I eventually, but.
Right. Mm-hmm. So he's reviewing, Cromwell's there reviewing, do you actually pray for the king like you're supposed to? Are you praying for his Queen Anne and not Catherine? And are you praying for Elizabeth, who the Catholics would have thought of as the bastard child who's illegitimate, right? Because Catherine is supposed to be his wife. So that's that's this one document, but
I mean, that document right there is so powerful in the sense of to get a really good grip of what. So I think a lot of people hear about the schism from the church. It just seems kind of like we're not doing any more goodbye. It was so much to take a whole system that was running. Really, I mean, if you go to, I guess, really Norman Knights time, kind of into the 1200s, really when the Catholic Church springs up again after Charlemagne, the 800s and so forth, and really starts, because it's really during the Holy Wars that they really start to connect with all these countries, get all these, troops to actually go and become knighted and become these Templar Knights and go. And so they're all into every country, and every country's aligned with the church. And so it's kind of weird because that's the Pluto cycle prior, right?
Yeah.
That they're setting all this stuff up.
Getting all the cathedrals and religious houses built.
And that's when
a lot of them are chartered in England around that time.
Yeah, and most people don't know that those old cathedrals of the late 1200s that end with Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn was the end of any stained glass windows with astrology on them, because cathedrals used to have the astrological clocks. They used to have astrology on them. The Catholic Church ends that during that time. So the last cathedrals that are in Europe that are really more of let's call it Western Europe, they all end during that cycle.
I talked about that in my little historical show on High Vibe. That I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, but I also talked about how the cathedrals that were built in France were built. Somebody discovered if you put the star sign of Virgo on the pathways of where the major cathedrals were in the 13th century, that it exactly corresponds to where the cathedrals dedicated to the Virgin Mary are. So they were literally using astrology in the way that it was built.
Yeah, and there's also one of my friends is doing a documentary right now that he's been and this is through the Catholic Church too, that they were creating churches, whether it was down in South America, and they were using very specific music and the way that it was built, these churches and cathedrals, that there was some sort of secret of like using this really heavenly divine power through the music, through the way the organs in there were, and also the notes and how it was done to actually be like a healing spiritual experience, right? So that was another thing that was super in alignment. So it's kind of interesting seeing how it's almost like they kind of don't want people to really wake up when you start seeing the corruption that happens. Because if you think about it, the Black Plague comes as they enter into the 14th century and the Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages really are kind of dark because everybody's dying, and then everybody's, there is no more quest anymore, right? All the holy wars end, and now it's the War of the Roses that comes after that, right? And there's just all this strife, and everybody's trying to see who's in charge, while the church is kind of just sitting there like, let's see how this plays out for a while. Mm-hmm. And we have our hand in every place. Like, so does it matter to them at the end of the day? It doesn't, because they still have the overreaching power until this moment.
So, I mean, even though we see the fall of the Roman Empire and Europe kind of goes into this more chaotic period where it's not as centrally organized, we have to remember the Roman Catholic Church is still centrally organized, and it is able to build out and have its presence everywhere. But the issue is that it doesn't make sure the practices are uniform, and that's why someone like Martin Luther comes forward and starts to criticize publicly and loudly, and then it gets printed. And the reason that spread is because everybody had been seeing this sort of abuse. But I mean, what Henry does here in these visitation reports, it goes
into the specific and the most minor places that actually are bigger, because it proves that there was no good oversight by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, how are these Italian popes going to be regulating exactly what's going on in the north of England somewhere, right? Here's some of it. I put the transcript of one of these books into ChatGPT and asked it to create a table of the most common offenses that that all these different people were doing. So these are reports. It's not, we can say maybe it was exaggerated, right? They compiled all the reports. So at the very least, people who lived around these monasteries thought these things were happening and informed on them, saying, this is what's going on there, right? Or they told on each other. And it's, it lists at every place what did they find that was irregular. And here's my table that I came up with. And these are the violations on the left that were supposed to have been happening in these monasteries and other religious houses. And then it shows you monks or priests who were accused of these things, bishops and nuns. And the things that aren't here, these are the most shocking things. What's not here is, were these people just appointed because of nepotism? Like it was
right, because
a
it
priest's
was
son
yeah,
who probably shouldn't have had a son, but he's still appointed. Or were they appointed to religious seats and they weren't living there and they weren't overseeing it? That was another thing that they were trying to get rid of. So there were these irregularities that you couldn't dispute, right? Then these are other accusations. So they're being accused of sodomy or voluntary pollutions, 151 monks and priests. And some of the accusations were things like 10 boys were sodomized, right? Like that,
which tracks with what, we've seen in the last decade. We've seen the Pope have to go do world tours for hundreds of thousands of boys that have been sodomized by the church, and in every country.
Yep.
So it's not like it was, what's kind of crazy is it's been going on for that long. There's something that they can't let go of.
It's just embedded in the culture from the very beginning of the institutionalized church. I'm not saying in Christianity.
Correct, of course.
And I saw a comment earlier in YouTube, in the chat there, where someone was saying, what's older, Christianity or the Catholic Church, right? And early Christianity wasn't institutionalized like this yet. It became institutionalized
not for 325
like
years.
Yeah. So anyway, and I don't know if this was happening since the beginning, but this is what was being uncovered in the English churches. And then it says sexual incontinence, 134 monks or priests and 17 nuns.
So does that mean that they are not staying? That means they might have like a kid with somebody. They maybe have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or even maybe a secret marriage. Or
they're not staying celibate.
Yeah, they're not staying celibate.
And here's what it says. Cases of sexual incontinence, sexual relations outside the celibate ideal are reported in a wide range of monasteries. In nunneries, there are several instances of nuns pepperit, I don't know how to say it right, giving birth, taken as evidence of breaking the vow of chastity. That would be pretty good evidence, I think. Incest or adultery, approximately 5. 2 bishops, no nuns. Requests for release from vows. So this was after they had visited, they would ask, do you want to be released from your vows? And there were 34 monks or priests and 5 nuns that requested that. In these particular, that's not of all of the visitations. That's just in some select monasteries and convents that were visited in this book. Other misconduct, theft, apostasy, conspiracy, 7 monks and priests, 2 bishops, and then superstitious practices, which was a really big, that would have been something Thomas Cromwell and then later Thomas Cranmer were really interested in trying to root out, because Anne Boleyn was also interested in this idea of there had been all these practices of people making pilgrimages to different religious shrines where there were supposed to be magical qualities associated with the relic there. And these more Protestant members of Henry's new church really wanted to root out that kind of what they saw was superstition, right? They didn't think it had validity. They thought it was more about superstition. So you can see that there's 40 monks or priests, 5 bishops, and 5 nuns.
It's kind of hypocritical because that really is more Templar Knight stuff, right? Like
that's what they were accused of as well,
right? That the Catholic Church is like letting people get away with that, but yet the Templar Knights couldn't do that,
right? Yeah. So,
and maybe that's what's interesting. If you take the Anne Boleyn and the Henry thing, Henry probably, he was raised, and his dad, Henry VII, was so about the idea of that kind of mystical Arthurian resurrection, yet being the younger son that you don't think you're going to become king, and then your brother dies at 12 and you have to marry now his widowed wife, right? Like, you're going to kind of not believe in any of that anymore. So maybe he doesn't believe in the relics, anymore, or this kind of Arthurian thing, it's kind of like,
Well, the Arthurian thing would have been the states, like the English states, rival kind of mythology, I think, to the Catholic Church's practices.
Yeah.
They would have seen that as legitimizing their state, but not necessarily connecting it to God in any way, or to the divine, or to the Roman Catholic Church. The Tudors coming to the throne was all about having won out of this really contentious civil war. Their side won, and then they're more concerned with making sure that the nobles and every power player in the country recognize their authority. So they connect it to that ancient English mythology, right? Or British, I should say, British mythology.
Well, because I think Henry's father, right, didn't his wife die having a child? And so, thank God the child survived or whatever. Like, Henry VII almost lost it all.
Yeah. So,
and even Henry V, had to go through all the big war, and he had to go fight on his own, and he had to be out on the battlefield. Like, the story of the Tudors winning is definitely not a easy situation, and a lot of it is about having a male heir. So that's kind of the central core of it. That's why it begins with that too. But the strife that his great grandfather and what they had to go through was way crazier, because they're actually blood on the battlefield, or wife having a child and dying, like stuff like that, and having to find another wife and make sure that an heir comes while defending the kingdom to hold the space. I love those parts of the story that precedes to that, because Henry kind of had it. Oh, my wife's not having a son. He's not having to really fight anything. He's having to fight the church. He's not having to fight swords in his face or blood in his hands, or
He's manufacturing drama.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's ingrained in him, and it's the way that it's going to survive, because there is no book written for him. He has to be the one that sets the tone of how the monarch succession works with his son after he does have a son, right? Like, that's what's interesting, is he writes the book on how today it works, and there's contention after that, but he's the one that really does kind of set he not only does this, but he sets the tone of, like, this is how succession works after that. Mm-hmm. So that's what's going to be interesting to see, what's the tone being set with now. I have a picture of, like, so people might have a better understanding of what a monastery would have looked like, painting wise, right? Like, they look like, churches and so forth, right? But they would, it kind of reminds me of Spanish missions here in California. It's this idea of these, places where they're kind of like little community centers that you worship. The people who are from the church, they live there. The nuns are there. You file your paperwork there. You might be able to get some clean water, maybe. I mean, you know, your horse can, you know, there's probably a lot of horses around and just like people.
A monastery is like a vast estate.
Yeah.
These are church holdings. I have to look
here
up
was
how much
here was
property
here
they
was
had.
one like
Yeah, they're like little mini villages.
like like crops, everything, and they're like mansions. And so I think it is kind of interesting them going in there and being like, well, what's really in there? So here's the monastery life, what it would have looked like going into a place later on. But you can kind of get the idea. That looks to me more like 18th century, maybe. Maybe
Yeah,
even,
I mean,
1892, so 19th century. But still, it's this idea of you still come in, you deal, okay, I have a baptism. And you never see baptisms on the day of birth. You always see them weeks later if you're really rich. If you're really rich, it's like literally like within the weeks. But usually you'll see them within the year if you're lucky, you know. Sometimes you'll see them 2-3 years after because you might not have the money or you might not have the, you know, the in with the monastery. Could be just a lowly person. That's one thing I've noticed through all my genealogy work is watching to confirm somebody in your genealogy. You know, the baptisms are a huge part because that's where they'll sometimes record the birth too. So sometimes there's nobody recording the birth because you're having a baby out in the middle of your life, you know, like anywhere in the world of that and 500 years ago. So, you know, it's not until you come in to report it and get a baptism. You usually see a baptism and a birth on the birth record and then a baptism resume sometimes, and then they'll name the parents' names, you know, and it's very simple. It's not this long, it's not like they were doing much. It was just like written like, okay, so-and-so had a baptism on this date. They were born on this date, and they have them just as the year, and then they name the parents, and that's it. So it's kind of interesting to think they were taking all that money and doing all that. But I think that's kind of an interesting photo of like how we see today. We walk in to our DMVs, we walk into all these places, and it is kind of a weird thing because the church itself is acting as the state, right? Like it's the one recording the births, it's the one saying, and so it's kind of like implanting the program that, you know, you might live here in England and that might be your king, but we're the ones that deal with your birth. We're the ones that deal with who you are. So it's kind of interesting that there's that kind of seed planted there. And then Martin Luther is the heretic who questions, why is the Pope acting like a king? Why is the Pope, you know, not following what his role is, which is to just focus on being the head of the church and to be a servant of God and so forth. He's acting like the opposite. He's acting like a king. He's acting like he's in control of everybody's life. He's telling people what they need to believe and what they can't. He's getting too involved, right? Like that's part of the thesis. There's many more things, but that's definitely one of the critiques that Henry ends up using. So I think it's very relatable to now with the Doge situation and these disillusion of these, you know, because I'll pull up this really quick. Like, so this just happened last week, right? Like the sign of U.S. aid was taken down. Unburdened by what has been. So they took down the sign, right? So
It'd be the same
it's
thing
the
in the
same. It's
monasteries.
very weird
Because the thing is that I just looked it up. It was 20 to 25% of the land that the church had in England.
Wow.
So logistically, obviously, the king wants access to that land. Because at the same time, Henry VII had been a really great, frugal monarch who left Henry all kinds of money. And Henry has gone through a lot of it by this time. And he also is implementing this new government. So I don't know if this is a sign for things to come. I want to know what you think. Because what Henry did with all of that monastic land is that he gave it to his friends and supporters, like the really influential people who helped him out. He rewarded them by giving them land and the palaces that used to belong to the church. So
I'll give you the answer.
Okay.
After the Revolutionary War, most loyalist land was confiscated by the Patriot-controlled states, meaning their property was seized and often sold off, forcing many loyalists to flee the United States, primarily to British North America, which is Canada today. That's why you see Canada kind of tripping out right now, where they were offered land grants to settle, but a lot of it went to the local friends of patriots, meaning the captain that was part of the Continental Army, and that was maybe his town. I mean, I think it's well described in the movie The Patriot. Like, if you can kind of like put yourself at the very end scene when Benjamin Martin comes into town and they're rebuilding the space, that it would be kind of like Benjamin Martin being like, yeah, that was a lord, and that was this guy's place. Why don't you all just take that over there? And let's actually take his roof and put it on my roof and take parts of that over there. And then you guys can figure out what you want to do with that. Like, it's
like the spoils of war.
It's the spoils of war. And so if you think about it, it's the same thing that happened with Henry. It's the same thing that happened in America, that all the loyalists and all the people that stayed loyal to the crown throughout the war left or had to flee to Canada or left and got back on boats, and including traders, right? Like, what's his name? Benedict Arnold, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, what happened to Benedict Arnold's house? You know what I mean? Like, that's a big question.
Something about that. What happened to Benedict Arnold's house? What happened to the Benedictine monks' houses?
Oh, I know. Well,
isn't that funny that even that comes up?
Right.
They were Benedictine monks. So, and I'm sorry. It's just
it's great. But I think I think that some people like forget about these little things that we think, oh, okay, the war happened. We won the war in America for independence. There was a lot of land that we won in that war that we didn't have access to, because you have to go back 100 years to even 150 years prior to the colonization of the colonies, and how the English were colonizing and setting all of their ways, and all the richest people who could afford to get on a boat to come over. That's why when you look at like genealogy records, a lot of people didn't come until, the early 1900s, right? Like, from Europe. But to come in the 1600s and even in the 1700s, you had to be wealthy.
And you were looking for utopia probably too.
Right. But that's the idea, right? That it was just all these people with and they were from esteemed families, and including the captains and the generals that all fought, that were redcoats, right? They all wanted to not betray their family's name because of their lordships under King George. So you have to think about like what happened to all those people's stuff. It was taken.
And it was given to the people, patriots who were loyal to the new cause.
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting about that in the American case, so maybe we could think about this in Henry's case too. You could only vote if you had property at that time.
Right.
So he's actually, whoever is giving that land or deciding we need this land to go to patriots, they are building the new country by creating the citizens that can manage it, right?
Yeah, and it's really in that 2 years, right, from the end of the war in 1781 till the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where there's some concessions made in the treaty saying, hey, make sure that some people get to reclaim some property through legal means or whatever. But so there's about a 2-year period where it's just utter chaos as far as if you're a loyalist, like you are bye-bye. And a lot of it was auctioned off to locals. So
similar things with the monasteries, that the land was, Henry claimed all the land first, so it all went to the state. But then he gave it out along with titles for his new, this is actually from something else. I don't know where that is. I can look this up sort of.
Oh no, that's like a cool little, like timeline.
Yeah. So.
Cause that's where we're really at. We're at the very beginning of this.
Yeah, this is over years.
And so like the years that come from all this, it's not going to just be a one and done. You exit the system and it's an easy situation. The effects that happen and then what either A, replaces it, or B, there's no replacement at all. And how does life, kind of adjust to those things is a big thing. And then also, a big part of what we wanted to cover was how was the tone of the people? Because right now we're seeing, what side are you on? I can't, in my head forever. Sounds like a drum, like it's just like we're all just gonna go into some horrible, it sounds like stone workers that are chained, like kind of.
But you know what's interesting? I looked up that song while we were waiting to start.
Right.
And it was written in 1531. I don't know if that means
that's exactly Pluto coming into Aquarius.
It was written in 1931. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
But isn't
that's Pluto being found in 1930.
And Uranus is that?
That's Uranus in Aries.
Okay.
Square Pluto.
So anyway, I just
Cancer,
looked up that song, which I think is interesting too, because in Henry VIII's time, it's the Pilgrimage of Grace and different uprisings of Catholics who don't think this is a good idea, right? But the thing is that there are plenty of Catholics that are cooperating with Henry VIII, right? So there's a lot of people who are willing to defect because they've been seeing abuses or whatever it is. I just find it interesting that this song is a union song, but at the same time we had that Teamster, like the president of the Teamsters, at the Republican National Convention this time and saying that the Democrats wouldn't talk to him.
Right.
So,
and I mean, this is dealing with, I get it that there's unions probably with federal employees, but this is like, I think of like the unions of 1931, FDR, the Great New Deals, right? Like all this stuff that happened at that time, Social Security, creating unions, right? Because it's an industrial revolution. Whether you want to call it the third industrial revolution or just this whole entire new technological one, it's there's no more use when you have a whole entire, mine that has all these employees working underground to store all the records on paper still. And, when we have computers and we have technology and we're spending all this money on paper still and people to work at a mine that they probably have to always make sure is okay. Like there's all these kind of things that make me think like, well, what? Like it really just like, I don't want to judge anybody because I'm not. It just does feel that people don't want anything to change. So, and I understand that. Like, I mean, I can be compassionate towards it and I can be empathetic to understanding it. But, I think it's harder for people who've always had the sure thing, the job, the paycheck that always comes to the government, and they do their job, which usually is pretty basic. It's not like the hardest thing in the world to do. I mean, it is to show up to work every day and do things. But I think that's what's interesting is like when we were looking at the visitations to the monasteries that Cromwell did, it's like kind of like how Trump forced everybody to go back to work as one of his first executive orders, like no more working from home. Like everybody needs to work in the office. Right. It kind of has gotten too loose, right? Like there's something that probably happened in the monasteries of like, that rule, let's not follow that rule. And so it is kind of like, let's do an audit on those things. Are they following this? Oh, look at all the stuff we're finding. And one of them is basic, like, okay, we know that during Biden, 30 to 40% of the whole entire federal government's working from their home. They're not working in the office that we're paying rents on, that we're paying these buildings on. So, it kind of reminds me of that. But the union thing, it's like, that's where it gets a little in the weeds. The unions of 1931 weren't about federal employee unions. They were about private industry unions.
Right.
So that song's for private industry, not civil servant, union, government jobs. You know?
I mean, so it makes you wonder, maybe something similar from Henry VIII's time would be people uprising for Catholicism, right, in the Pilgrimage of Grace. They want to defend the church, and they're maybe not even looking at the reality of, is the church even meeting our needs anymore? Right? Because most of those uprisings, I mean, they are all led by wealthy nobility aristocrats who are Catholic, but they are benefiting from the system. They don't need the services of the monasteries. They have no clue. And then the people join up because they believe, yes, it's our.
Yeah, they grew up
we're
with
Roman
it.
Catholic. We're defending it.
They grew up going into it.
But they maybe aren't even looking at, are we actually benefiting from this system or not?
Yeah, I like how it says here that the people that will remain deeply attached to traditional Catholic worship, because that's what's hard about religious aspect, that even the way our governments work have like a ritualistic thing. Like you're 16, you go get your driver's license, you go to DMV. Like I'm using kind of modern way of looking at it, right? You go to Social Security office, you get a job, you make sure you pay your Social Security, you wait till you're 65, or do you want to take it at 67 or 71 for more? You know, these kind of things are very much, they're not religious, but it doesn't matter if it's religion or if it's government. There is a ritualistic kind of pattern that is expected, but nothing ever lasts. That's the thing in history that I noticed, right? Like there's times in history that just look like it'll stay like that forever, and it doesn't, right? Like we all don't go to monasteries, anymore.
Some people do.
Some people do, but
it's like a retreat. It's a special thing. You're not
right.
You're not going there. You're going to visit the local monastery. Like I lived in Kentucky for a few years, and there's a monastery that made. What if they made bourbon? I can't even remember what it was.
That's interesting.
And you could go there and visit and get that and leave. And it was like a tourist destination.
Or I would call it more community-based, like center, like, to bring the community together and stuff, which I think people associate their churches today with, like, worshiping, doing community work, and meeting for places to do these things. But it's interesting that when you leave, let's say, the church for a funeral service, you still got to deal with the coroner's office. That's part of your state or county, right? And there's a separation there. So when we talk about separation of church and state, that's a good example. Even separating the constitutional part, you go to your church, you do a burial, but you're still dealing with the coroner, right? Like you're still dealing with those aspects. And then you're dealing with where is the burying or the cremation going to happen? That's not done by the church. It's always done by some sort of authority that has a coroner's approval. And so you have to get an approval to do a cremation. So that it's interesting. And then the negative responses were especially fierce in the more conservative north of England. So there was this whole, it's so weird because it's kind of happening in the north of America, right? Like all the northern states that are on the east and the west coast are the ones that are really upset about what's happening. So Oregon, Northern California, Washington, Maine, all these states that are up higher, Connecticut, they're all the ones that are all kind of congregating to sing these very humdrum union songs. And they're also complaining
You yourself said it's catchy.
It's catchy. But that opposition, because I wanted to ask, like, what was the public reaction? So, of course, the Pilgrimage of Grace becomes, and it's really interesting because they actually look at it, and this is exactly how the media is looking at it, that, well, we like Trump, but Elon is corrupting Trump, or Elon is this bad person, and so it's all about trying to get Thomas Cromwell out and let Henry just do the right thing and restore things the way that they used to be. So it becomes this really kind of crazy, organization, and they were able to get at that time 30 to 50,000 people, which that's a lot for 1535 into 36, especially in England. I mean, to get that many troops in a war is rare at those times. And they wanted to remove evil advisors and restore the faith, thereby saving Henry's soul. So it kind of is weird, because are the people complaining about Elon Musk wanting to get rid of an evil advisor? Yes. And restore the faith in the country? Yes. But is it thereby also wanting to save Trump? No.
No, but I think
so it's
what
connected.
we have to look at, though, is like, it could be similar, because what people would have been arguing in the 16th century is the king as an office, like the monarchy itself is meant to be this special office that shouldn't be corrupted by advisors who are not the proper type of advisors. So these people also are very smart by saying, we're not protesting the king, we're protesting his advisors. They're avoiding, or they think they're avoiding charges of heresy, right? Or what is it called? Not insubordination, but when you go against the government.
Insurrection?
I don't remember the word. There's another word, and someone could say it. But they think they're avoiding treason. That's it. Oh,
treason,
right?
yeah.
But I don't even remember. It took so long to get the word treason.
Yeah, they're avoiding treason, that they're okay, so the king doesn't get upset, that it's more about his advisors. Yeah.
It's about the body of the king. They're arguing it's the body of the king that shouldn't be corrupt. So I think now people wouldn't be arguing that Trump should be protected and not have these advisors. They're saying the office of the president is being corrupted by all of this. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, and it's true, because they're actually directing a lot of it towards Elon, or calling him the President Elon.
Yeah. Or
stuff like that. Or there was but you know what? I want to show this, because it's like, you showed that image earlier about Henry. That's that one picture with all of him and his advisors during the schism. Well, this is the Time magazine article or front cover. And I thought it was so crazy that they put it with Washington and all of the people. I think that's, what's his name? The French.
Is it Lafayette?
Lafayette right there.
Behind the camera.
Above your head. Oh. In this corner right here. But anyway, I thought that it was interesting that they did that, but maybe that's actually not, that's above their head. Sorry, because they're in the Capitol. That's right. They did the inauguration in the Capitol.
So that's the actual picture. How funny.
Is that insane?
Wow. So what does that headline say? Donald Trump,
the inauguration of the 47th president of the United States. And I think Elon posted it, right? Like, and he just posted it. He didn't even make like a quotation or anything. But I just think it's really interesting, because there's that Thomas Cromwell right there, right?
There's Anne Boleyn.
Right. And then, there's RFK, there's JD Vance, there's Pam Bondi, there's all the people that are part of, the cabinet. And it's funny, because in this corner is Joe Biden, of all people. Half his face. Right? And that reminds me of the images of like, kind of the way that like Henry likes to show like him in the middle with his family, and like you see like Rome on one side, and then you see like a monastery that's now in England. That's a Church of England monastery kind of to the other side. It's just really weird though that we're in the Capitol, and the picture right above is at the same Pluto.
Right. So at that previous Pluto, those were the innovators.
Those were the heretics
and shakers of their day, like and the loyalists
were upset because remember, there were loyalists that didn't want to go to war. There were loyalists that understood, and these were their neighbors and their friends that became rebels, right? But I think it's interesting going back to like the rebellions. There's definitely going to be some sort of rebellion against this.
But will Trump act like Henry VIII? Because we were looking at the Pilgrimage of Grace earlier, and we know that there's a couple of things Henry did in response. One of them was he made sure that the rituals of the Church of England were very similar to Catholicism. So if you walked into a church and you came into the service, it would look very much the same as if the Catholic Church was conducting the service. The only difference is now you know, oh, the Pope's not the head, it's Henry VIII. But also, he did this other trick of negotiating with the pilgrims who conducted the Pilgrimage of Grace.
Yeah, because they took over York, which is up north, which is so funny that that's also what Washington lost at the beginning of the Revolutionary War was New York, right? York.
And then it ends in Yorktown.
And ends in Yorktown, right? Like but what's weird is that Henry doesn't fall for it because here's some of the interesting things that they targeted. The king versus the advisors. Notably, the Pilgrimage of Grace rebels professed loyalty to Henry VIII, like you said, but they didn't depose him. They wanted to reform the evil counselors. One of their demands was that Cromwell and others of his faction be punished for heresy and treason. They sought for the removal of a bunch of other different officials. And then Henry doesn't fall for it and says, if only the good king knew, he would right the wrongs. Or that's what the rebels were saying. That was their humdrum song. If only the good king knew. Right? However, Henry VIII was not fooled by the distinction. He understood that rejection of his policies was in effect rejection of his authority. And the outcome was they were out. There were so many people, they didn't even have an army to sustain it. So he sends Norfolk out there to negotiate and says, all right, I promise to address your grievances and we won't be going through all these monasteries and changing them so quick. We'll kind of slowly do it and let you have your grievances. And then by 1537, they find out that he doesn't care. And Henry seizes the opportunity to take over 200 people and executes them all the following year and kind of shuts that up.
Right. So he addresses the concerns and the fear about we're losing our institution by saying, okay, you have a point. I'll listen to you. Let me hear what you have to say.
Right.
Then a year later turns around and 200 of you are executed or whatever.
Right.
So do you think something similar would happen with how Donald Trump or the administration will resolve this?
I mean, I think that right now it's in the courts, and already today, a federal judge just finally allowed Trump to do what he is with the stopping of payments, right? So like the freeze has been undone because the court found that the executive branch. So this is also what kind of over part of this was too, is if you are the leader, and in this case, it's the executive branch, right? And all these departments fall under that. Well, you have the executive power to fire, freeze payments, even if it's allotted by Congress. You're the check and balance on the government, meaning the executive's a check on the Congress. It can veto bills, and then it has to go back to Congress, and Congress then has to either vote 2/3, right, to overrule a veto. You have to look at it that way, but you have to look at that the money that's appropriated by Congress, it gets filtered through the executive. But the executive should be able to say, well, if this is fraud, let's not use the money and spend it there. Let's stop the payment. Right? There has to be a check that way. And nobody ever talks about the executive's check besides the veto. Right?
Right.
So it's interesting because if it's a law, that's one thing, but if it's about money and appropriations, it is the purse. But if it's going to things like a federal bureaucracy, that's where the executive, it's not like Trump's, like if you think about it, he's taking the money and saying, no, we're not going to spend it there anymore. right? Because he's getting rid of the things within it, right? So why would you pay people? Like, let's say if you were a business owner and, you're a public corporation, you're a CEO. And so a bunch of money comes through from the public stock, like the stock goes through the roof, right? And let's say you get rid of a department, but everybody wants you to keep that department, but you get rid of it. Are you going to just start paying the people in that department that you get rid of? No, right. So people have to kind of look at it like it's a check in a direction we usually don't look at. We always look at the check and balance as if the executive is the all powerful that needs to always be checked. But that's why there's the check and balance of the executive to be able to check on these departments to make sure that he's running them through cabinet members that take over. And that's why the Senate puts their hearings to be able to say, this is the people approve you as the president's choice to be appointed as a cabinet member that overlooks this department and this department. And you're allowed to hire special employees with so all Doges was another program that Obama put in to root out corruption and wasteful spending, that they changed the name of it to Doge. So they didn't create Doge. They just took something that was already intact, and you're allowed to hire, as the executive, you're allowed to hire. We've hired in many times in history of presidents and stuff. You're able to hire special government employees for a very short term to be able to do certain things.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I would say it's similar to Henry VIII also, because he doesn't create a whole new system of government all of a sudden, right? He stays king. He just removes the Roman Catholic Church, and then he does it in the English way, because remember, he was arguing for that statute, the English statute of primary that says the King of England needs to have authority within his own realm, and no foreign body should have a say in how things are run in England. And that benefits not just the king, but the aristocrats, the nobility, the members of parliament, and the king does his reformation with parliament. So he's not trying to overturn the whole system. The system is actually, while they're probably watching friends and family having issues with what's happening to our religion, in the end, so many people in parliament stay with him.
Yes.
Because they recognize also they have that, first of all, they probably see, because the Reformation ideas have been around for years, they might agree with a lot of the criticisms.
Yes.
They also probably think, yeah, why are we sending all that money out of our country? We should be benefiting from it.
Yeah, because in 1529, Parliament had aired grievances about the clerical courts and the corruption. And in 1532, the Commons presented the supplication against the ordinaries, a petition detailing abuses by bishops and priests. It accused church officials of misusing their power. So if you think about the last 2 years in Congress, we had all these hearings in the oversight about, the review on whether or not there's been weaponization in our government, right? And also oversight committees in wasteful corruption, spending, all these kind of things, right? So these were the grievances that the Congress had done. Then the people came and elected Donald Trump. And if you look at polls, most people wanted to root out stuff, do all these kind of things that he's doing, right? So it's interesting that Henry didn't have the people on his side. He had Parliament who represent the people. But
right.
In the case of Donald Trump, he has the people that voted him in, and the Congress that are voted in by the people, and the Senate, right? Everybody's wanting it. So it's just the minority that doesn't want it. And that's what's really interesting. And especially when you see that the funding to a lot of these, like whether, we found out Politico was funded by the government, right? So a lot of these like media corporations and stuff, why have they stayed alive when nobody's watching? The government's funding them, right? So that's where it starts to get in the weeds. But I think that One of the examples was charging exorbitant fees. Well, we're seeing that now we're paying all these taxes and we pay all these fees while they're doing things, or people for heresy, or persecuting people for heresy without proper witness. Now, I might be a little controversial and say that kind of reminds me of January 6th people, right? Like people went to jail for walking in when the police said, walk on in here. A lot of people. Or you could look at it as parents that went to school boards, right? Complaining about what was happening with lockdowns and COVID procedures and so forth, that the FBI was showing up at their house or arresting them, or abortion, right? Like just by standing outside an abortion clinic and holding a sign saying, you know, I believe in pro-choice or pro-life, right? Like, and being arrested. Like that's right. So like people are getting, and no witness either. That's what's kind of crazy. Or excommunication for trivial causes, which is very much, well, I think what that weaponization over the last 4 years was. These are trivial things that people are getting calls for. Or like it reminds me when you see in Canada people who, oh, you weren't locked down, you were still doing something, and they show up at your house. Or what's happening in the UK right now? Oh, you're posting this online, so we need to take you in. I mean, this is stuff that happens at this transit, and you either push back against it or you don't, or you go with it. And so it's interesting that Henry was the one that pushed against it. And also there was the grievances that was in the Commons at that time. And then there was another part where Henry leveraged these complaints to pressure the English clergy. In fact, he confronted church leaders with charges and forced them to acknowledge him as the protector and supreme head. He's, of course, a monarch. The corruption charges became a bargaining chip, and as the break progressed, royal propaganda increasingly painted the Roman Church as a rife of abuses and exploitive practices. And that's where Cranmer, who becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the head of the, he's not, well, the head of the church is the king or the monarch, but the I guess you would say just the Archbishop is the head of the church, but not the full head of the church. It's the guy running the church, right? And he runs all of the bishops and everybody that's within the church, and how the church operates day-to-day functioning per se, right? And rituals and spiritual services. So that you have him and Cromwell argued that the king had a duty to protect his subjects from the abuses of Rome, which that's actually in the Constitution, right? Like the president is the commander-in-chief, has the authority to protect the number one role of the federal government in a federal system mixed with this. That's why it is a constitutional republic, that there's a federal system that all it's here to do is to protect the citizens and implement the protections of the Bill of Rights and the basic fundamentals of freedom and so forth, right? And defense is the other part, right? Defense of the nation, because during the Articles of Confederation, up until the Constitution, the states had to defend themselves. There was no federal enforcement. If somebody after the Treaty of Paris were to come in from Canada and invade Maine or invade, any of the other states now, they would have to defend for themselves. There was no central federal. And so that's where the Federalists definitely kind of, I would say, had some good points of needing a federalized system in, a restricted way, not a total federal system, or why we have the Electoral College, voting, and how that works. It's the same example. So it's kind of interesting but the executive has the duty to protect the citizens from foreign or domestic situations. That's what the military is for. Or practices of rooting out corruption that are abuses by especially foreign governments or people using money and giving it to their foreign governments. I mean, to me, the Fauci emails that are all redacted about the Wuhan research and all the money that's given there, is that what we pay for? I mean, these are the things
we'll
that
find out, because I'm sure it'll be in his museum.
Well, they just
unredacted.
canceled the museum, but yeah.
That's right. Well,
Here's the concrete example involved financial corruption. Large sums of English money flowed to Rome through taxes like Peter's pence and payments for dispensations. Henry's reforms cut off these outflows. So that's exactly what is happening right now, asserting that each exactions impoverished the realm for no holy purpose.
Yeah, going in and saying this is not efficient. This isn't an efficient use of the English resources. So rip the Band-Aid off.
And then there's the moral corruption, which is definitely happening now, right? Like why is the money going to aid kind of these agenda like things like the trans situation of like a trans show in Iraq, right? Or, you know, well, I don't know if that's exact, but I know that, I think it was Sesame Street in Iraq, right? Like there was like 10 million or whatever. But like all these kind of agenda from the left, like it's not even really about aid. It's just about spreading kind of your message where you want to go. And so there's a moral aspect too, because this went into that a royally commissioned survey we just went into the laziness, sexual misconduct, and financial mismanagement among monks and nuns, and the act of parliament that closed the lesser monasteries bluntly declared that manifest sin, vicious, carnal, and abominable living is daily used and committed among the little and small abbeys to the high displeasure of Almighty God. I think it's so funny in West Hollywood, the biggest gay bar is called the Abbey.
I think that's probably on purpose.
Correct. It comes from
Right.
that. But I bet you a lot of people don't even get that. They go there.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't know.
But I think that's where it feels almost like eerie.
Right. There's a lot of examining, or I guess a lot of value judgment being placed on where is this money going. So the taxpayers putting money into this organization that is endowed with a particular mission. So it's like the English subjects are putting money into this institution that is supposed to be doing clear things, right? In the case of the monasteries, they took religious orders and you could actually look, here's how you're supposed to be living.
Yeah.
Is that how you're living? And they weren't. But then there's this other element of, you know, what's actually happening there. And then it clearly shows that there's a difference in conduct versus the morality.
Yeah.
But again, and the things that are happening aren't sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church. So then you have to wonder, well, who's doing these? Why are they doing these things? I mean, it's really similar in that it's things coming up about conduct or ideologies that aren't necessarily part of the stated mission that a lot of people find morally dubious, or, you know, people are thinking, that's not what we should be spending our money on.
So, I mean, this is Henry IV and his marriage to Catherine in France, or kind of how it gets to the place. So like the idea was always that, you know, the Catholic Church is the one that is, and that's what's kind of interesting too, is it put things in a new perspective, being the Church of England now and marrying monarchs off to, you know, royal, you know, children of other monarchs in other countries, that it doesn't have to go through the Pope anymore. So it kind of benefits also trade and other things that are with other countries without having to go through the third party anymore that's approving it. These were just like some kind of images. I think the other one was better up top here, that we didn't get through all these images, but like here was that Pilgrimage of Grace. This was a painting that would represent what it looked like. They're all outside, just like everybody, saying, Elon, blah, blah, blah.
Which side
are you on? This was Cranmer, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I have to ask you because Cranmer, Cromwell, Thomas More that we talked about. I mean, I sort of asked you this, right? They all ended up executed by different people. Some by Henry VIII, some by Mary, who came after him, or after Edward VI,
Right.
his son died. And that's one of the things that English historians really look at is, like, what did people do to actually, is there anybody who actually made it from the beginning of Henry VIII all the way through to Elizabeth I? You know, how did someone survive all of those and navigate all those changes? But the key players ended up executed. Now, today,
Yes.
I wouldn't say we're not executing them, but publicly.
What about Cranmer? I don't think
He also died under, is it Mary? He died a heretic to Catholics and a martyr for the principles of English Reformation. His death was immortalized in the Book of Martyrs. He's burned at the stake by Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary.
But Bloody Mary was very Catholic in origin. She did not.
Yeah, she married a Spanish man.
Yeah.
I mean, she's super
Well, and the
Catholic.
Spanish loved to kill people in those times, especially if you were Aztec.
There are a lot of people that died at the hand of Spaniards. That's for sure.
Well, and they were the hand and glove and the sword of the church for inquisitions,
very
right? So
early
if you think
on,
about it, like,
starting with this whole time period that we're looking at, even before the 16th century, they're implementing inquisitions.
right.
They're converting people who are Jewish, making sure there's no Jewish people or Muslims in Spain. You have to convert or get out, but you're not going to be able to practice your faith. And then they start persecuting heresies to double down on what's Roman Catholic. So they are the most Catholic, and Mary was married to the king of Spain, who would be the most Catholic king. So
That is just,
yeah, it's interesting to think about what's coming up, that whether it's just figuratively that people are executed in terms of whatever that means in today's world, that your governmental career might end, or that in some way you become a martyr for a different cause because of something that happens to you publicly, right? So that to me is an interesting aspect of this.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and there's the difference that, like, Henry had this, like, relationship that he really wanted, and one to end and one to begin, that kind of satisfies him for only so long. Whereas I think in the case of this, you know, it's not about a relationship to a person, but a country purely that we're seeing right now. But it reminds me of the Revolutionary War, because the same ideas of corruption are written in the Declaration of Independence, that whether it's taxation without representation, it goes even deeper into how the people were being treated in the colonies. They weren't given a voice. They weren't being seen. There was the Stamp Act. There were all these things too, by the way that, you know, people, you know, they kind of did overdo the whole, what do you call it? The Boston massacre. Like, it was only a black guy who died, and, you know, but they had made paintings that everybody, drawings and sketches of it, that all the redcoats lined up all these, you know, colonizers.
12 people that died or something, right?
No. There were some injuries. There were some injuries.
I stood there on that area and read the sign.
Yeah, and you know who did it? The sketch? Paul Revere, or
right.
was it?
I remember looking at that.
Right. So this is the sketch, right? And it shows these people like but what's funny is it was about, there was a Private Hugh White stood on guard outside the Boston Custom House on King Street. A wigs maker apprentice, approximately 13 years old, named Edward Garrett, called out to Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch accusing him of refusing to pay a bill due to the master there. And then, so while he left the post, challenged the boy and struck him on the side of the head with a musket. And then the kid cried out in pain. His companion, Bartholomew Broaders, began to argue with White. That attracted a larger crowd. As the evening progressed, the crowd grew larger and more boisterous. Church bells were rung, which usually signify a fire, bringing more people out. More than 50 Bostonians pressed around White, led by a mixed-race former slave named Crispus Atticus, throwing objects at the sentry and challenging him to fire his weapon. White had taken up somewhat safer position on the steps, and he sought assistance. So anyway, long story short, Preston shouted, the crowd estimated at 300, 400 people to disperse. But
see, look, 5 people died because of the Boston Massacre. Not, I mean, I don't know where I got 12, but not directly on the field. I looked, it was someone, it said Crispus Atticus died that night. Samuel Gray died that night. James Caldwell died that night. I don't have it up. I was looking on my phone. Samuel Maverick died the next morning, and Patrick Card died from his wounds nearly 2 weeks later. So,
well, the whole idea was that it looked like everybody died.
Yeah, but that's enough people to die where you realize.
I mean, it is, but
these soldiers don't really care about us.
I know, but you don't see Crispus anywhere in here. You only see white people.
No, in that one image, I think it's made before the Civil War.
Right. I think Paul Revere gets his name from this, but it's kind of interesting. He can't even draw a moon. Not really nice, but he does show there was a moon out, quarter moon.
Why do you think he drew it like that? Was that the actual moon at that time?
That's kind of an interesting point. I mean, I look at it like he's showing blue sky, so it looks like it's a moon up in the day. It's a quarter moon, right?
Huh. Because they really did. I mean, they would have been looking at almanacs and paid attention to all that stuff. They did care about what phase the moon was in, because it mattered about whether you could be out at night or not.
Let's just for fun look at the astrology on March 5th. 1770, right? It's in Boston, right? In Massachusetts. Boston. Around like 4 p.m. I don't know if it says there was a time, but the moon was below here. Oh wait, I don't know why. I hate this thing. March 5th, 1770. There we go. Quarter moon up in the exact same spot in Gemini. Look at that.
So he was right.
So looking at the horizon with I'm going to just kind of show people again. Right. So that's crazy.
Does that happen late in the afternoon?
Right. So, and that's what my prediction was, because of the moon being where it is in the blue sky.
So funny.
Right. So if you look at it, right, any kind of, bigger buildings would have been built on the north and south. Okay. And always have the east and west. If you notice, that's how a lot of buildings are built in the old days. So you know where you're at. So you know where north and south is too. And the ecliptic being east and west. So I literally picked the exact moment, look at the moon in that same corner and where the sun is on the horizon. So it was a Pisces sun and it was a moon in Gemini, and definitely it was just a quarter moon, like I said. How weird is that? I never looked at this chart before in this picture this way. I just did this right now. But that would have been really interesting, because that would have been Venus, it would have been hidden because Venus is so close to the sun. And it was Saturn rising, and you wouldn't have been able to see it until the sun comes down, and it would have been a moon Saturn that evening. So it would have had that kind of Hum-da-dum. Serious things that happen. But yeah, that's kind of a interesting chart to see. I was able to instantly go right to it and go, yep.
Why are we looking at that one? I mean, what did that have to do with the
ideas of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence are the same grievances of Henry VIII and the money, to the taxes, to the way that people are being treated, to that people don't get a voice, and that the idea of the colonies having a voice have to be approved by Parliament that's 3,000 miles away overseas. The same grievances that are happening with Henry VIII, with Pluto exiting Capricorn, coming into Aquarius, of you guys are all the way another 3,000 miles away. You guys are all the way in the Vatican, and you guys are saying this, and you have all these monasteries, or the loyalists, you have all of your loyalists, and you have all of your redcoats everywhere. So now it's the same thing, but it's within our own borders. But also there are NGOs and foreign things getting our money, and they are influencing by, money that they're influencing here, or TikTok, or any of these things, right? Like, it's the same thing. That was my point, is that this is the third example of Pluto and Aquarius, and we're seeing the same thing pop up.
And at the Boston Massacre, what stage is Pluto at that point?
That's more at like 1770s. So that's that's like where we were at in 2018.
And what would that have been like? What would that have been in Henry VIII's time?
In Henry VIII's time, it would have been in the 1525.
Yeah,
so when he's making the grievances, he's even trying to get Anne Boleyn to have where nobody's allowed to be with her. Writes like a proclamation that no man can be with her. And he's trying to find all of his ways. And he also writes a bad... What was it? He wrote for the church against Martin Luther.
That was 1521.
Oh, 1521. Okay,
he wrote for the church. Because I was looking at that earlier, we had another date. Was it 1525 or 29?
Yeah, 1520. Yeah,
where he was. Oh, wow, he's already flipped to that side.
So the beginning of the flip, I would say, for him, hardcore would have been 1524 and 1525, based off these. That would have been the Boston Massacre, and then for us, that's the impeachment of Trump for Russian collusion. That's BS, and the fake news media lying, and then going into COVID with fake news and saying that, hydroxychloroquine and Trump is just retarded. Now that's what they say to use, right? Or the examples of that there's no voter, suppression or voter problems when there are, right? Like, and the lying, or that there's no Hunter Biden laptop, but there really is. It's like, all of that is exactly what's replaying with what the revolution had to go through and Henry had to go through.
It's funny because it's in June 1525, Henry VIII made his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, so that's another illegitimate son, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Right, so he's already thinking,
there's something about Wolsey in there. Impose a tax on England at the bottom after Mary Howard. So there's a tax imposed the same way that the Boston Tea Party is what follows the Boston Massacre 3 years later, right? So
yeah, the amicable grant. We're so happy to grant you this money. So that you can, what was it he wanted? Wow. It took between 1/6 and 1/10 of the goods of the laity and 1/3 of the goods of the clergy. So already.
So it's the same thing.
Concerned about his legacy, like what's going to happen when I don't have an heir. And also, we need more money. So a lot of things go out the window at that point.
Yeah. And so I think that's where, using all these cross parallels of 3 Pluto transits ingressing into Aquarius, you see a very common thread. And so to me, I think kind of in like the beginning of this summarization, And to put it is that what we're seeing right now with Doge is not crazy to me. If anything, it's actually one of the main reasons that I made the prediction Trump would win. I made it more about the mundane astrology, not so much his chart. I said, well, he's saying he's going to do this. This is what the revolution was based off, and this is what Henry VIII did. I said that very profoundly. I said, this is off mundane astrology. I said, I didn't even use like Trump's progressions. I didn't even use Kamala's. I used just some basic transits, but I didn't really base it off that. I based it fully off that I knew that this transit's so powerful, mundane-wise, that this is going to happen.
But it's like it's happening more on the level of Henry VIII's time. And so to me, it says we're setting up for at least 200 years of a new system. Like whatever's setting up now,
right, it's true,
is going to evolve into something that we'll have to revisit, right? But then it's going to become again something else
and
that we
it
can't even
takes
imagine.
Decades to get fully figured out. Like the Constitution, after the Revolutionary War, it takes almost a decade. I mean, it's.
And what am I saying? I mean, like 500 years.
Right,
We're
but
setting
like
up something that will play out for 500 years.
It takes, by the time that they get to the end of the 1780s, right, like to finally figure out the Constitution, and then, Washington as the first president is the one that gets the Bill of Rights in the Constitution because they put that cutoff date of 1800 for so many things like that would stay forever. There was like a little loose thing, but you have to have an old book to know that. They don't put that on the websites anymore. But like that's what's interesting is that Washington's the best president because he did. Yeah, we have to thank President Washington because he's the president that did make sure the Bill of Rights got put into the Constitution. The convention did not. So it takes a while to get all that. Or if you think about Henry, the idea of this new church is great for him and his relationship, but it figuring out the monasteries, it figuring out how are people going to do, like what things are going to keep from Catholicism. Like, are you still going to do Lent? Are you still going to, do all of these? Are you still going to do confession? Are you still going to, right? They have to rethink all of that.
Marriage amongst the clergy.
Right.
That wasn't even figured out until his son. So
right.
it's you set something up and then in practice it plays out. Then there's a
right.
reaction and then it plays out. That's I think what we're about ready to see is, but what I think is interesting right now in particular is that you pointed out that Elon Musk is a Cancer. We have Mars retrograde in Cancer right now. The United States itself is a Cancer.
Yeah.
And so much of this is, and Henry VIII was a Cancer. And so much of this is about creating the foundation for everything else, creating the foundation of our home.
Yes.
That will nurture and sustain us as we move forward. And ensuring that it is something that can nurture us and sustain us for a really long time. But it's just so interesting that every so often, like this many years with this cycle, that kind of issue comes up. Like,
yes.
What is our home going to be? And then everything else comes out of that. So then who gets to belong to our home? How do we defend our home? What are we actually going to do from our home base,
right.
And that's what's unique about the United States, I think, is that we were founded to be that sort of a country.
Yes.
And not all countries have that basis. Although I don't know I guess the rising is Sagittarius, so the IC is
Pisces.
How strange, too.
Hence, the home has been very slippery, like understanding what we call the home of America and like the roots of it are defined as has been very confusing.
But also,
right? So like,
that
and it's been
spirituality
slippery.
is a big part
But also,
of
if
it.
you like get really deep and follow the progression chart of America, like it's been a progressed moon in Pisces, right? Like balsamic moon and all that kind of stuff too.
It is right now.
It has been for quite a while, yeah, during these very confusing times. But like with Thomas Cromwell and Elon Musk to do a comparative astrologically, we don't know his birthday. They only know his birth year for Thomas Cromwell. But so when you run 1345, what I find interesting is one, the North Node here in Pisces with Chiron and Aries, which we're in right now. So that's kind of an interesting signature. We're in that right now when he was born. But to try and compare it to Elon Musk, now you have to use big planets like a conjunction of Jupiter Neptune is a good example. So does Elon Musk have a Jupiter Neptune conjunction? Because we don't know his month and we don't know his day. We only know the year. So the only thing that's really powerful about that year that stays throughout the year is that Jupiter and Neptune conjunction. So then when you look up Elon's chart, that's what you do when it's just a year. Like you can only go off like what's the major transit of a year, right? Like, and in Elon's chart, guess what he has in almost the same spot, the Jupiter Neptune conjunction.
And again, his is in Scorpio and Sagittarius.
Yeah, and this one.
Wow.
Well, what's interesting is if you go to the beginning of the year, it was the same thing.
Right now in the year
In 1345, when
1485, right?
1485. And what also is interesting is Pluto is in Virgo near the end of it for Elon, and Thomas Cromwell was a Pluto Libran, just like Henry VIII was. So he's a little younger coming in than Elon is. And he's older though than Henry VIII.
Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah. Because Henry VIII's born with Pluto at 29 Libra.
Right.
But I think it's interesting seeing the nodes being exactly with Chiron. Like that's what's really interesting about 1345 here is like just the idea of the birth of Thomas Cromwell is the same nodal transition we've been through from 2024 into this 2025 with Chiron. He was in the womb or born with it in Aries conjunct or like it is right now. But either way, what we've witnessed in the shift of the year, just in these last 2 months, is exactly what he was born under that signature, and that's what he did. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that one of the things I taught with Nostradamus's secrets is what you're born with, and when those things reenact in history, the person or the energy will be that way. So it's not surprising that we're in the same transit and we're seeing a Thomas Cromwell architect the dismantling of corruption and money and things that go against the sovereignty of the American way, per se.
And not only dismantling it, but being the one who has experience in doing the administrative work of being able to go in and dismantle it. Because Cromwell was the secretary for Wolsey, the one who was trying to be the cardinal, who's trying to be the pope. So Cromwell is sitting back learning all of that. So I guess I don't know what Elon Musk did early on, but the thing is that Cromwell understands the system from within,
Yes.
and he also understands what Henry VIII wants and is able to implement it because he knows how to do it. I mean, Cromwell was probably like his era's AI, where he could figure out all the numbers, and Elon just employs the AI.
That's very Jupiter Neptune. So that's what Elon has. It's the widest vision that you can have, Jupiter Neptune conjunction. I know because I have it. So every 13 years, Jupiter Neptune conjunct. And it's interesting because both of them have Neptune in Sag with Jupiter. And that's me too. I have Neptune and Sag with Jupiter conjunct my Neptune. And it is the widest vision of all things there is. So that's why Elon sees SpaceX to an electric car to how to do AI to PayPal and people look at me like, how do you do the astrology and then know it and then do the electronics and build the studio and blah, 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 right? Like, it's not just a singular thing you look at with Jupiter, Neptune conjunct in your chart. You see all of it up, down, left, right, and wide, and at different angles that are very unique. And also, Uranus was actually with not Elon, but in pretty good sextile, as you can see, not strong, but with Cromwell, he's got it with Uranus. And so what's crazy is the people born and that were part of the Pluto Aquarius transit during the 1530s, they all, like Henry VIII, right, all have this like Pluto Libra, like Uranian, Sag coming into Capricorn energy, but they're all born with this stuff, which is kind of crazy. And same thing with the people now. So this one tracks more with the 1500s than it does the Revolutionary War, the planetary alignments of the people going through it, generationally wise. And so actually, he might have dressed pretty simple, but he was not a simple man. For him to write all that stuff and to understand, we're looking at all this stuff, and I mean, to handwrite that and execute it and do all that work, it definitely is not a simple process, but you have to have a wide vision. And that's what they both have in the signature. And so that's a pretty good signature to see as far as like comparative astrologically in the same zone, because we don't know the date, right? So if I just move this to the beginning of 1485, let's say he's a Capricorn, right? So this is May, this is April. Let's just do January. You can see that Jupiter, Neptune. So there's that North Node Chiron like we just had at the, end of 2024. And then we just saw it ingress North Node into Pisces. But there's that Neptune and then Jupiter right here, right? So Jupiter at the beginning and Neptune right there in Sag, right there. And they say it's around 1485. So it could have been, it's also on Julian calendar. So you go back and there's Jupiter, Scorpio, Neptune in Sag, just 1 month back. So it's the same Jupiter, Neptune transit.
And did Henry VIII have the same one you said, or no?
No, he was a little bit later, but I have his chart easy to get. Of course, yeah, I mean, him and Trump don't have the most similar of charts, but...
That's what I was going to say. The weird thing is from Henry VIII's time, there really isn't a Trump, right? Or do you think he's the most similar to Henry VIII?
I mean, I would say they're very similar. That's Edward... Henry, right?
Yeah, you have to count down to the
1491. Here we go. So Jupiter's past Neptune, right? Like, so where's his Jupiter? There's Neptune still in Sag, Pluto in Libra, so that they have that same thing, right? Him and what's his name? Cromwell and Leo King. Saturn Aquarius, but this is what's interesting is Henry VIII's sun in Cancer sits where like Elon Musk's North Node, rising is, which is kind of interesting. And also Trump's Saturn, Venus sit pretty close to that. America's sun. So people don't realize when you run Julian calendar, this is America's chart. Henry VIII is America's chart by a day because you have to add the 10 days, right? So if you look at America's chart, it's 13 degrees Cancer, right? This is 14 degrees Cancer. So June 28th is traditionally about 6-7 degrees.
That's very strange.
It's a week, or sorry, it's a week. Julian calendar is a week. So like if I just now open up as a second chart here and I just do the declaration chart, right? I think I have it in here, declaration. There we are. Boom. Sun 13, Sun 14.
You know what would be interesting is...
So Henry VIII is the Declaration of Independence chart sun.
That's crazy. Okay.
Because they were signing and doing it the day prior on July 3rd, and July 2nd is when they began it. So you have to think that this idea of breaking away in independence has an actual weird theme of Cancer energy where the star Sirius sits.
Okay, so I wonder, would it be even interesting to look at Henry VIII's progressed chart at the time of the Declaration of Independence signing?
That's what I'm doing.
It's his progressed chart?
Oh, his progressed chart? I could look at that.
Would it be
look at the
interesting?
north node of America, and the Mercury is on top of the Mercury of Henry. Right? Or like there's some of those interesting things with that. So, I'll make this to where everybody can see this, and I'll do the bi-wheel here. So, and I'll make it small so we can kind of bring it in here in the middle here. Here we go. Look at over where Pluto is in America's chart, right? 27 Capricorn. When Pluto was crossing in the 1520s in Capricorn, it was crossing over the Uranus of Henry. So he was seated with this, I need to rebel. And by the time it came into Aquarius, it was ready to, come in, and it was ready to conjunct his Saturn and oppose his Mercury. And that's where he gets everything. And then he has the problems with Saturn in Aquarius and that opposition to Mercury. Like Amberlyn isn't loyal to me. She's having sex with other people, even though I had sex with his sister and had a couple kids before I married her. Like, very interesting stuff there, right? The South Node also sits of America on Henry's Saturn. There's a lot of interesting things there, but to run that progress chart, they'll be interesting. So I'll take Henry VIII's chart, and I'll do his progressions for July 4, 1776.
I'm just feeling like he actually is the seed for the American Revolution then, right?
Correct. And we'll do secondary progressions, and then we'll do it for... Oh, and we'll do it Boston. Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, so even though it's Philadelphia, same shit. This will be an interesting random thing to look at, but so inner chart is Henry's progressions. Outer chart, oh my gosh, this is actually insane. So I will annotate to make this easier to understand. And with the crazy astrology idea. I love it.
Well, I learned that from you, that you've said after people's death, like they can live on, or something
Right.
about them lives on in their progressions, right?
Right. Because to get my little stupid pen up, I have to get rid of it.
Yes, Henry VIII was all about planting his seeds. Somebody said he implanted his seeds for sure. The problem was he kept implanting female seeds, and he got mad about that.
All right, there we go. I can do it now. All right. So the progressed this is mind-blowing. The progressed Uranus, so Henry was born with Uranus in Capricorn pretty early on. the 248-year cycle plus, it was actually more like 70 some years, right? Finally had made it to progress to exactly on America's Pluto. Okay. 2,
Wow.
his Pluto in Libra at 29 had only progressed, because remember, this is like 200 and, well, he's born in 14, he's born in 1491, I think. So to 1776, however many days that is for years, right? So 1476 or 1491 to 1776, it's almost 300 days, like, you know, a little less. So it's not even a year, but you have to think that's 270 plus like years. So you only progress for every year 1 day. So you have to progress, you know, most of our lives, we only do like 70, 80 days in our chart. We don't do that many. But that's what's crazy is, so his Pluto was in Scorpio at 3 degrees when it was at 29 Libra. So his progressed Jupiter was sitting on the return of Jupiter in America's chart. Like, yeah, that's what's weird. Right there, you can see that 4 degree progressed Jupiter, and he had progressed to be a Aries at 27 degrees. Remember, he was a Cancer, so he's gone all the way around to the 3rd quarter, right? And he's got progressed Sun, Mars there in square to Uranus. So it was kind of bringing that up in the progressed chart, but it's also his progressed Sun in square to America's Pluto. So that's kind of some interesting stuff. I think the Uranus conjunction to the natal chart of the Pluto and the declaration chart's pretty gnarly.
So would you say
because
it
it's
represents
it represents this idea of that, how I used that Henry's schism brought about the Protestant movement that then turns into, when King James comes in to create the Pilgrims, ironically, the same name that went against this idea of leaving the Catholic Church, the pilgrimage in 1620 on the Mayflower creates a Mayflower Compact and leaves England completely to go begin the idea of the colonization of the Americas today. They didn't even know what it was, the New World. They didn't know what was there or anything. And then, of course, you know, that turns into what we know as the colonies over, you know, about 100 years later, right? And then now it becomes the Revolutionary War, and it's the idea that we can leave but not be a king. So it's like, thanks for showing us the way, but we also don't want to do this kingly thing where we're mixing church and state in order to leave the church.
Yeah,
because it's not just leaving King George, it's also leaving a schism from the Church of England. It's another schism in that sense, because it's also saying we're going to have freedom of religion here. That you don't have to do it. You don't have to be that. We're not going to judge you. You can be in politics. You can be in government, not have to follow. There is no Archbishop of Canterbury. There is no. So it's another schism to the church completely being no church.
right. So it's
a quantum leap of a Pluto Capricorn. That's what the progress chart was at, about what Henry did. That they were having conversations about what Henry did. And it's actually in Thomas Paine's books, it goes into that.
About what?
About Henry's schism from the Catholic Church and the idea of republics, right? Leaving this idea of how monarchies work. So he addresses in common sense about these understandings of how to build a republic. So they actually didn't really know how to build the republic till Thomas Paine produces the book on how to build a republic. And it's because Thomas Paine goes into the way it went from Henry VIII, the schism, and then goes into old, of course, Roman times, but brings it all back to actually showing a separation of three branches, and actually it's like almost like a sketch, kind of like that you were on a cocktail napkin, but making a pamphlet book out of it that spreads like wildfire in 1776, that eventually gets to the hands of all the signers of the Declaration of Independence to give them this kind of scratch idea of what it'll look like if they win the war. So the conversation of Henry was happening inside Declaration Hall.
Yeah. I mean, so if we look at this as a progressed chart, it's showing you, had he become a vampire and lived that long or whatever it would have taken.
Correct.
He would have actually become something like the United States.
So if you take the progressed chart of today, right, of America, let me just do this. Okay. I'm going to have to make it a little bigger. Okay. That progressed moon, or so that progressed Pluto is at 29, getting ready to come into Aquarius. Probably not in our lifetimes, but it's getting close. The progressed new moons happen. So that's what's interesting. A year ago. So see now the progressed sun's at 20 Pisces. The last 2.5 years of the Biden administration, who is he? Where is he? Was the progressed moon in Pisces balsamic? During the Pluto return, during Pluto coming into Aquarius for the first time and coming back. So this idea of this new America has now begun because the moon has now ingressed into Aries 3 months ago, right? Like so.
Wow.
This is this new start energy. And Mars is still in retrograde in Libra, which is kind of the problem with America trying to go and fight wars.
So we should be being diplomatic instead, or?
Correct, because if that Mars retrograde, so if you take the progressed chart and I go back to years, you're going to kind of trip out when you see when this Mars stationed retrograde. Here we go, right? 2007, and that's when we realized Iraq was the dumbest thing we ever did. So from 2003 to 2007 was the 4 days of the station of Mars. So of course the Iraq war was going to be a waste of time, right? So if an astrologer was counseling, right, the Department of Defense and President Bush, they would have been like, are you retarded? Like Mars, there you can see it at 18, it literally in 2007, and then the great financial crisis as well is based upon all the money, not just the mortgage issues. It was also the fact that we raided the till to go into this crazy war in Iraq and Afghanistan for so long, and then hire private contractors and do all this stuff on top of the financial crises that were happening. And the sun had just come into Pisces in 2007 in the progression of America. Now, what's going to be interesting is when America actually, people talk about the Pluto return. The craziest is the return to the sun of a country. That's a while away, but we're not even, like America's 248 years old, right? So it's going to be 249 years old. So we're not even near 360 yet. So that's why you see the progressed sun in Pisces. It's still not back to Cancer. And we're actually, and so that was interesting, right? Like, and we went into that progressed full moon, and it was in Virgo in 2009 when Obama came in. This kind of like, where's reality going? And this idea that it feels like it's this kind of new reality that's setting in, but it's really not. It was also Venus on top of Chiron, and we were in a deep financial recession and crisis, right? And that you take it to today, and I'll make this here. So now we're at a progressed new moon that just happened a year ago, but it happened deep in Pisces. And now that moon is out of Pisces and ingressed into Aries 2.5 months ago, 3 months ago, right when Trump won the election. The progressed moon was leaving, went into Aries, 0 degree, where everything's coming. And that Mars is still in retrograde. So, Mars is a 3-month ordeal. So, America winning wars for the next, 80 years is not the same. It's in its detriment. It's retrograde. So, Mars was in Gemini when America's chart was, and now it's made it to Libra and retrograde. But, there's something about America's chart that's going to be okay financially. It's done with the opposition from Venus that's progressed in the opposition to Saturn. So it's in Taurus, and it's sturdy and it's strong there. It doesn't have much complications to it. But yeah, that's kind of like how you can really kind of judge things.
So when everything hits the 0 point of Aries and our moon is there, what will that be like? Our progressed moon is there?
Well, our progressed moon's moving every month, so it won't be there. I would think that would have been a little bit harder, but the fact that the moon's kind of setting the tone every month right now that goes by of where we're going to go over the next couple of years. That right now, these are potent moments that have happened just recently in the last month, because this is where Saturn and Neptune are coming, right? Like Neptune does come up to like 2 degrees, right? And then or I think it's like 1.25, and Saturn comes up to the beginning of 1, but then they retrograde back. And so the moon at 2, everything that's happened in the last month is all about where Saturn and Neptune are going to really deliver the dreams to become real, and the stuff that can't become real too will be known. So that's quite an interesting moment. We're a North Node Leo country, but it's in Cancer at 25 degrees, and that's kind of interesting seeing that Mars retrograde over that, or how weird the progressed Jupiter is at 15 degrees retrograde of Cancer, and that's right where Elon Musk's rising sign is, and that North Node sitting on Trump's progressed Venus, his progressed Saturn. People really, I don't know why people thought Kamala was going to get in. I didn't even use this.
The progressed chart?
Yeah, I could have made the choice just instantly off this chart right here. Because if I just take it back to election day, it's really easy now in the new updates, so I can just do this now, and I can just go by month, right? So we could go to election time, which is November, and then we can go a week back, right? It was on the 5th, right? The day, November 5th. So we go to the day, and there's that progressed moon at 28 degrees of Pisces, and knowing who's coming in is going to be with the progressed moon in Aries. Fire sign. Or fiery person. And the North Node and progressed Jupiter all over the Cancer transits of Trump that he was born under, and Elon, who was stunting at that time. So it would have been pretty easy if you would have used this. I'm surprised a lot of astrologers predicted Kamala off that. What? With Mars retrograde in Libra? So if those that think Gavin Newsom, look at how bad Gavin Newsom's life has been with this Mars retrograde in Libra. Huh.
Right.
Or how bad it's been for Kamala the whole time it's been. Since 2007. So I wouldn't recommend Libra as being in political power at the moment.
I won't be running for office, so I'm not worried.
Right. That's just kind of not you're not going to have the growth of the stunt to the power that you think that you will. And that's what makes it kind of interesting, because Uranus and Gemini there, Gemini or Taurus with Venus there. Aries is a little funky with Chiron. Pisces is definitely Mitt Romney missed his moment because in 2012, the progressed sun was there, so it almost felt like it, right? 12 years ago, but the progressed sun was in square to the natal Uranus of America. So the country wasn't ready for another Pisces president, plus Neptune too. Aquarius, that's going to be weird because Mercury's there, but the Pluto's getting ready to come into Aquarius over these years. And Pluto is in Aquarius, right? So
do you ever look at what is the prenatal eclipse of
Oh
the
yeah.
US? Where is that?
I mean, like, like for America, it's a Leo North Node, right? So you can just recently use, go to the declaration chart, and then sheets here, and go to so it was 15 Leo lunar eclipse and 0 degrees Pisces solar eclipse. So what's interesting are that, remember the North Node is in Leo. It's the North eclipse is the lunar in Leo, right? So we're going to be in the flip, meaning that like the solar eclipse, sure, we're going to get some Pisces eclipses starting in 2026, but that's going to be with the North Node, not like the South Node in Aquarius that it was born under. So it's flipped. And also the nodes of America are getting ready to flip too, right? So it is that means the country's making a U-turn, and this is the beginning you're starting to see of it, right? I always say when the nodes have flipped in your chart, the universe is saying, stop, you're in a big semi truck and make a U-turn, and it's gonna take a long time. It reminds me of Austin Powers when he's like in the little cart and he goes, that's when your nodes flip in your chart transit at 18, right? At 9 and 18 when they come back, and then at your Saturn return, right before your Saturn return, and as it coming in, your nodes flip again. So 27, 26, and 28, those are brutal. That's the brutalist transit. Every 26 to 29-year-old is always in for the biggest rudest awakening of their life. But America's going to have this, like, we're not going the direction we thought it was going. And so you can already see that beginning. But to see also that it was a Pisces solar eclipse and it was a 15-degree lunar Leo eclipse, we've had Saturn on that, solar eclipse point, and so that America also has a lot of weird deception happen. So like good example, Saturn ingressed into Pisces back in 1994, and Bill Clinton was the president, and all the stuff of Monica Lewinsky started to come out by the time the Saturn transit ended in Pisces, right? So everything about the Biden administration came out as we're in the end of Pisces. Right, it's all coming out right now, like what he was doing and stuff. But Biden didn't go for another term. Bill Clinton got elected because people felt enough, like it's okay if it was just sexual shit and you lied to us about sex. It wasn't corruption, right? You're just a bad husband, and you are a bad president for lying to us about sex stuff, but people could kind of understand that. So that's what's interesting is like every time the Saturn comes into Pisces, it hits the solar eclipse, prenatal solar eclipse of America. Although it's weird because I think using prenatal eclipses are different for a country than a human being because of the womb and the eclipses and the nodes and the way they work with the womb. So it's 136 days before. That's second trimester, right? So that's really where you start. It's definitely not a fetus. You got a human being in there that's got a heartbeat, starting to feel emotions, starting to kick. The mom's feeling the baby kick. But you can also look at it as in February 4th and February 19th of 1776. That's actually, and I mean, I'll just to show the history of people, and that is where it'll blow your mind, is the inception. So the idea of where your prenatal eclipses are is when God sends the code, this soul's coming in. It's preset. So it's kind of like you and God are like, that's the body you're going in. And that's also why in human design, it's not out, like Ra never put it out there, but the 88 days for the design chart, it's Mercury's just one rotation, right? So it's really interesting. Mercury sees all the planets in 88 days. So it's the last moment where I feel the prenatal eclipses are, this is your code. You're going to be in here. It's like the stamp. And then Mercury's last 88 days around the sun, heliocentrically, says hi to all the planets to understand all the body parts, to understand how they're all going to connect from the moment that you're born. Right? So if I do February of 1776 and I do Thomas Paine, right? So, of course, let's go to right here. Common sense. This is, right, the claim to the title, The Father of the American Revolution. Most people don't know that, which rests on his pamphlets, especially Common Sense. It came out January 10th, 1776. So by the time that the printing presses of that time put it out in that month, from the 10th to February 4th, and then the next one that comes at the end of February, that eclipse, everybody's finally getting this understanding of we can do this and truth, because he addresses it to the inhabitants of America on the following interesting subjects: the origin and design of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution, of monarchy and hereditary succession, thoughts on the present state of American affairs, of the present ability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections. Thomas Paine. Man knows no master save creating heaven, or those whom choice and common good ordain. Thompson. But yeah, Philadelphia, 1776, January. So the idea is right there.
Yeah, and when you think about how long it would have taken to spread around and for people to be reading it, it's about February, probably, when people are really talking about it.
Yeah, to get printing presses to print all of them, and then to actually get them to people, and then for people to read it, and then to actually do it, definitely would be in that month and when the eclipses start to hit. And give the rise to it, because just to finish that history, so it comes out, Common Sense, right? And it, in 3 months, so there it is, in 3 months, to 2 million residents of the 13 colonies. That's like over a third. I think it's almost half of those colonies, right? And during the course of the American Revolution, one biographer estimated a total of about 500,000 copies were sold, including unauthorized editions. However, some historians dispute those numbers. But that's how crazy it is, right? So it spreads like wildfire. Paine's attack on monarchy and common sense is essentially an attack on King George, whereas colonial resentments were originally directed primarily against the king's ministers in parliament. So there's another Pluto and Aquarius thing, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's mad at not the king, but like the Elon Musk or whoever. But then it starts being directed at the person. Which side are you on? But but yeah, that's what's really crazy. So, and also his son is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who's my first cousin, 9th removed or whatever. So anyway, I think that was good. That was a good way for people to see that. I don't think that this is crazy. What would be your final thoughts here, Anne?
My final thoughts would be, I like the idea of thinking that we're in a U-turn. That really helped me think about it. I've always thought it seems like there's a continuation where we continue to build on this idea of what does it mean to be free within a larger state or a larger community. Because we're always trying to do this balance between we need to live together with other people because things work better. So how should we organize ourselves and who should be our leaders? And to me, it keeps progressing to where people gain more power and authority, or
right.
And I can see how it's so interesting to me how Henry VIII put something in motion that we could still be feeling the ripples from, right?
Yeah, and I think that ripples, especially in that time, that his actions then inspire other countries to do the same. It's not as dramatic, though. It's just like, okay, yeah, we're not. Especially like the French Revolution happens, and it's like they're not really thinking about what is the Catholic Church going to say as they're in the streets with guillotines and stuff. They're not even worried about that.
By that time, the church isn't even really a consideration.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, but in the monarchs just keep going, but like the ideas of the church and that, it really just starts falling apart naturally. Like that's the straw that breaks the camel's back of that way of governance of church to monarchs. So to me, it's the same way that America's independence inspires others to break from monarchs, although not a lot of countries do it, right? Now this is, once you've broken away, you can't overdo the fat, and you also can't let people kind of, it's the same theme though of like corruption, stealing money, using it for wrong things, and you root those things out. And it feels like a rebellion against these energies that just want to sit fat and happy the way that they have it. Because to me, it's the visitations to the monasteries that blows my mind the most, because it does, when you read the history, it always starts with Henry and his dissatisfaction with his wife and all that. So it always comes across as it's about his wife, even though it roots out this way deeper thing of like, look at these monasteries, and they are affecting the kids there. They're affecting people. They're not following the rules, but expecting other people to follow the rules and judging them and telling them to confess more, telling them to maybe pay more, treating them differently as well, probably. Like it really is kind of dark and shady. And so it also is this idea that, oh yeah, like we can control kings too. And you bend the knee, and we use God to do that. And I think that there's that now from a government perspective of like, this is the United States federal bureaucracy. Like, you bend the knee, even if you're the elected president as a person who gets elected by the people. It's ending. Right? And because I don't think that a lot of Americans are ready for true freedom. America already has a problem with the Second Amendment, right? People are like afraid to carry a gun in their car. People are afraid to go, express their Second Amendment duty. Like, that's when you know there's a problem. People are more afraid of their First Amendment duty, which I think is interesting, because like all the founding fathers and anybody who really, had a stand in the debates for whether it was the Declaration and talking to all 13 colonies, or you go into the Articles of Confederation, but actually at the Constitutional Convention, the number one fear in every person in the world that's the most is public speaking. So if you think about it, you had to be a public speaker to make anything happen. So public speaking is number one when it's not guns, it's not swords, it's none of that. It's debate and knowing how to, get your voice heard. And so the number one fear of most people is the First Amendment. They're afraid to post something. What is my boss going to say? What is my neighbor going to say? What is this person going to say? Or Second Amendment, oh my God, what if I carry a gun in my car? Well, if you put the weapon, it depends on the state. In California, if you have the weapon locked in a lockbox and you have the ammo locked in your glove box and you tell the cops, are they going to get you in trouble? No. But most people don't know that. So it's like, like we're in a world that people are afraid to express their freedom. They're so attached to the same way people were attached to the monasteries. They're attached to, what would it be like without Department of Education? Well, we did it for hundreds of years. I mean, the Department of Education is a new thing compared to the longevity of how long we've been a country. Or, this idea of all these other departments like USAID, like what? We lived almost 200 years without that thing. Like, the government lived for a long time without 2 million of government federal employees. So like it's people thinking it's all over when it's not. Mm-hmm. And I think like the lesson from Henry VIII's succession is, gosh, how much nicer is this for everyone? You get to actually read your Bible in English now. The country that's native to, and the Bibles start getting printed in other languages, because it kind of was this like capture that the Catholic Church had on, no, it's Latin only, and most people didn't have that ability or whatever. like everything changes because of what he does. And it opens up to a different world and people start to express themselves. And it really, the Renaissance period, you know, if you really think about it, explodes right after it. Like, so, you know, in many ways, I don't think people are ready for true freedom. And that means that you're not reliant on some sort of government entity to tell you what to do and how to live and what's right and what's wrong and all these kind of things. But most people are terrified to do that. That's my final thoughts.
Good final thoughts. I agree.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for watching. That was really fun, Ann. And I hope that, you know, you were able to see where we were going with this, because I think we've talked about this period, but not really gotten into those specifics. And then now we have enough stuff that's happened here at the beginning of this transit to actually really find some extreme parallel actions that are being taken that are similar, not just towards Henry VIII's time, but also the Revolutionary War. And so we're overlooking a current Pluto transit at the beginning and the prior two, but especially going back to the one that really is more closely defined with people living through it, because if you use the astrology of the generations and the outer planets, it's more relatable to them, and it's pretty doggone similar. So make sure that you join us on High Vibe TV. Any last words, Ann?
No.
No? All right.
No, I have nothing.
You have nothing? Putting your camera on you. Any last words?
My last word is have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Much love to you all. Follow Ann. She's everywhere. You can find her, The History Ann, on Instagram, or is it History Ann? History Ann, or
it is The Historian.
Or I think it is the
Instagram and History Ann.
And History Ann on YouTube, and High Vibe TV, of course, as well. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you on the next one. Adios. Bye-bye. Take care.